Hello, everyone. I'm NAR President Vince Malta, and welcome to the 2020 Sustainability Summit. It's great to be with all of you, even if it's virtually. This is NAR's 4th annual Sustainability Summit, and it's the first to go virtual. How sustainable is that? Today, we actually have 2 audiences. Some of you are on the Zoom call. Others may be listening to the live stream of our summit. The folks on the Zoom call are from the NAR committees and are participants in the Sustainability Summit. Those of you on the call, I invite you to contribute. You can type your questions or comments in the chat box, and I look forward to doing some brief Q&A with you in just a few minutes. Someone asked to say it, so it might as well be me. Thank you in advance for being sure to mute yourself during the call. We really appreciate that. We're excited that a virtual format means that we can connect and engage with many more of you than we could have in person. And hasn't that been one of the silver linings with COVID-19? So it's a good thing that we're more engaged than ever with these new communication tools, because the issue that brings us together today is urgent to our industry. And while COVID-19 has come, and someday I hope very soon will be gone, the issues and the work that we do around sustainability will be with us and have an everlasting impact on all of us. Extreme weather events leave death and destruction in their wake. They also exact huge consequences for property values, homeowners, real estate transactions, and our entire industry. And they're happening more and more frequently. It's hard to forget the devastation across Texas and Louisiana after 2017's Hurricane Harvey. At one point, roughly 1/3 of Houston was underwater. That same year, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, leading to power outages as long as 11 months, and sadly, nearly 3,000 deaths. 4 years of insufficient rain and snow created the worst drought in California in nearly 40 years, bringing water shortages, rolling blackouts, and blazing wildfires. The list goes on. The top 10 extreme weather events of the past decade alone have cost more than $400 billion in damages. And that price tag pales next to the lives lost or those lives irrevocably changed. Generally, isn't it better to invest funds in resiliency efforts before disaster strikes and we're forced to pick up the pieces and rebuild? Certainly it is. That takes forethought, and we can do that. As realtors, we're always thinking a few steps ahead. Realtors have a role to play here, both to protect our clients and our industry. The issue affects and should be personal for all of us. It certainly is for me. I'll never forget last year's Sustainability Summit, where I joined some of you in New Orleans. I'm a 3rd-generation realtor from San Francisco and a proud Californian. Every day in New Orleans, I had the opportunity to speak with and hear from sustainability experts in our industry. And every night, I returned to my hotel room and watched my home state burn. So many members were affected by this. Some lost their lives, and it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. The 2019 wildfire season in California burned more than 400 square miles of land. That's nearly as big as the entire city of Los Angeles. I believe realtors must become more resilient and sustainable in the face of these extreme weather events, and that's why we're here today. And sustainability is about more than extreme weather events. It's also about good business practices. Our clients and customers demand and expect realtors to provide guidance on this topic. We have an opportunity to embrace sustainability as a business opportunity that directly affects the bottom line of your business, and it's the right thing to do for your family, customers, clients, and your communities. Because this issue is so urgent, shortly after last year's summit, I called for the creation of a special Presidential Advisory Group, or PAG, on sustainability. The Sustainability PAG was tasked with evaluating and making recommendations on how NAR could best assist members in the broader real estate industry to become more resilient and sustainable in the face of extreme weather events. That PAG recently finished its work and delivered its conclusions and recommendations to the NAR leadership team. Briefly, those recommendations were, first, that NAR commit to a long-term sustainability plan by partnering with private sector consultants to develop and implement a formal and detailed sustainability plan. Second, that we leverage the already established NAR policy committees and programs to continue the PAG's work. Third, and finally, we must better integrate sustainability issues into our leadership. The leadership team has approved the report, and NAR is working to implement the recommendations and drive the association forward to continue this important work. Now that we have a path forward, it's up to all of us to act. You've already taken a crucial step by attending today. We have an outstanding program for you. We'll hear a sustainability outlook and forecast from an expert in NAR's research department. We'll hear a data-driven presentation on how extreme weather impacts the real estate industry from a data analytics expert. We'll learn more about resilience and sustainability in the era of COVID-19. And our keynote speaker, the co-founder and CEO of GreenBiz, brings a balanced business voice firmly rooted in sustainability efforts. I want to thank my friend, Eileen Oldroyd, for her leadership as chair of the Sustainability Advisory Group, and Vice Chair Georgia Meacham. Eileen will also be our MC today, and you're in good hands with her. My thanks to the entire Sustainability PAG for their hard work as well, including the chair, Craig Foley, who I asked to work on getting the report out, not in November of 2020, but by last May's meetings. They did, and did it through an unfamiliar new communication tool back in March and April called Zoom. Even though many of us have Zoom fatigue now, it was something relatively new. So thank you. We're all grateful for your hard work and bringing it to us so soon. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here. Our call to action is urgent. Whether you're in California, Connecticut, or anywhere in between, we all share this one planet and we all share the responsibility to protect it. We've made progress, but there's still much to do. Luckily, we have forward momentum on our side. Interest in this topic has increased as more and more industries see how this affects their bottom line. We want to establish NAR and Realtors as the leader on this front. So now is the time. Now is the time for us to commit, to work, and to lead. Inaction is not an option, and a job this big means we must work as a team and bring in others to collaborate with. Thankfully, the Realtor team has a winning record in coming through for our clients and our communities, and there's no other team we should be more honored to be a part of. At this point, before I welcome our keynote speaker to the virtual stage, I'm happy to take a few questions that you may have, and so either you can do that by unmuting yourself or doing them through the chat box. So feel free.
Thank you, Vince. Hi, I'm Eileen Oldroyd, and I am checking out the chat box to see if any questions come in from our audience. But Vince, you mentioned how this is an urgent topic for NAR to take on, and that you escalated the Presidential Advisory Group, your PAG, you escalated the PAG in order to make this happen as quickly as possible. So was it when you were in New Orleans last year and dealing with, they're still recovering from Hurricane Katrina, and FEMA's claims are exponential when it comes to natural disasters, and then you go back to your hotel room and you're checking up on your friends and family, and the whole state is essentially, having wildfires. Is that when you felt that this was something that needed to be escalated?
Yeah, absolutely. When you get closer to leadership as well, you want to make sure that you keep things moving, and that your leadership team is thinking as a team, so that this is not, let's say, if I have a passion for it, next year it's just the ball drops. So fortunately, we have a great leadership team. Charlie Oppler is our incoming president. He shares the same passions. I know that he's spoken to Georgia about that. So hopefully that is seamless and we carry that through. But yes, um, uh, the more you know about this issue, the more you realize its urgency. Okay, and we can't just be spectators to this and watch things happen. We have to be active participants. We have to lead on these issues. It's like anything in politics. If you're not involved and you don't find it, it will find you. And so we need to be there for our communities, for our clients and our industry. So very important. And what's, as an aside, everything's been like put on the side because of COVID-19. And this is not a time to let our guard up. There are things that we can do proactively today, as I'm sure some of these speakers will be addressing. We will get past COVID-19. We have shown one thing that I think is really important is that realtors do act. They are resilient. They are adaptive. So we can do this and we will do this. So that's, I think, a really encouraging thing. So I think right now, information stage, get that information out to our realtor members, show their importance, show how they could be active participants in all of this, and the rest will take care of itself.
I agree. And last year, or this year, was the 50th anniversary, or was it last year was the 50th anniversary of Fair Housing. And this year is the 50th anniversary of Green Day. And so I know that us greenies, that was a really big anniversary for us. And it's appropriate that NAR is now so member focused on such an important topic, because it's right. We are hyper focused on COVID and the pandemic. However, when it comes to being visionaries, you need to think 5-10 years into the future. And I think what we need to emphasize here is how member-driven NAR is on this topic, that we really want to make this a cultural shift within NAR. And so my question is, and actually Mabel is full on right here asking her question, how do we communicate sustainability as a good thing for the bottom line for our members and consumers? So thank you, Mabel, for that question.
Right. So just like we're using Zoom here, okay, COVID-19, necessity is the mother of all invention, okay? And what you're finding is that our clients have been using a lot of these tools and they're embracing these tools. Our members are embracing these tools. So these tools will help our bottom line, okay? We're finding as well that our members do and are very concerned regarding the energy efficiency of their property, where their property lies, how will that affect them in the future? All of these things. What can they do for mitigation? That's if we can concentrate on that, provide resources in this area, that will ultimately help our bottom line because consumers want this. And if they're not made aware of it, okay, then they're going to be sorry they weren't. So this is a great opportunity for our members to take our knowledge here, okay, and be on the cutting edge of this and using that to assist our clients, our industry, our community moving forward. It's what we call a win-win. Just like COVID-19, as tragic as it has given the opportunity for our members to reach out to people. What can I do for you? Do you have any questions? And this is an area that we can do that as well to engage our members. So ultimately, great for our bottom line. And again, it's the right thing to do.
I agree. And one of the diamonds in the NAR family is Lee Brown, and she talks a lot about community and relationships. And this is another level of communication you could have with your clients and homeowners. And this is one of those great tools to have in your toolbox of robust conversations of sustainability and resiliency. So thank you, Vince, for bringing this up to the forefront and bringing these thought-provoking leaders that were speakers that we're having today. So thank you so much. And Now 11:15. It's time to introduce Joel Mackauer.
And
So
I'll
I
do
will
that.
hand it back to you, Vince, for that
Thank
introduction.
you. And Eileen, again, thank you for all you're doing. And it's a pleasure being here. I look forward to listening to the rest of the program. So it's time to introduce our keynote speaker. Joel Mackauer is the chairman and executive editor of GreenBiz Group Incorporated and the founder of GreenBiz, a media and events company that explores the opportunities at the intersection of business, technology, and sustainability. GreenBiz is widely regarded as the leading authority for business sustainability, innovation, and green marketing. And for more than 25 years, Joel has been a well-respected voice on business, the environment, and the bottom line. Joel grew up in California. Yay, Joel. Graduated from UC Berkeley, go Bears, and worked as a journalist and as a nationally syndicated columnist. He is a frequent guest on NPR's Marketplace, a financial news program. Today, he serves as a senior fellow at the Strategic Innovation Lab at Case Western Reserve University, a think tank focused on developing, testing, and implementing a grand strategy for America to power a new era of prosperity, security, and sustainability. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including The E Factor and Beyond the Bottom Line, two of the earliest books on corporate social responsibility that did a great deal to frame the debate and still shape it today. Proving he is a person of many interests, one of Joel's books is an oral history of the 1969 Woodstock Music Festival. Rolling Stone magazine called it the definitive history of the event. He's written the story of a musical revolution, and today Joel is here to tell us about the revolution in the corporate world to make sustainability a national imperative. No wonder the Associated Press called him the guru of green business practices. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joel Mackauer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Vince. Wow, that was quite an intro. It's really a pleasure to be here. And while I'm sharing my screen, let me get this going here. I first want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. Wish I could be with all of you in the real world, but this is the world we have now. I am the proud son of a realtor. I grew up in a world where my mom was constantly out to show houses, hold open houses, meet with clients, present contracts. I have deep, deep respect for all that you do and all that you help happen in the world. And I couldn't be more appreciative of to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you to Vince and Eileen and Amanda and everyone else who put this together. So I'm going to talk about this world of sustainable business and how it relates and what's going on out there and what the opportunity is in your world. And it's just a fascinating world. I've had the great good fortune of being a part of for 30 some years now, and never gets old. And sort of to set the stage, I want to spend the first just few minutes giving you sort of the bigger context of sort of this big company world and what's going on out there. Then we'll get to your specific world and what I see happening, and so we'll take it from there. So first of all, I want you to imagine where you get your news from, wherever that is, online or offline. And what if you were to see the following headlines? That one of the largest brokerage and investment houses on Wall Street has started committing to having a carbon emissions metric for every loan and investment it makes. Or that one of the largest consumer goods companies in the world had just made significant water stewardship global goals to conserve water, not just for its own operations, but for the communities where it operates. One of the largest tech companies in the world had formed a consortium to get other big tech companies to accelerate the shift to a low carbon economy. That another massive tech company just committed to no carbon from its supply chain. It was going to eliminate all of the carbon dioxide emissions or neutralize them from all of its products by the end of the decade. That a major retail brand said they were forming a coalition to replace single-use plastic bag, or that one of the largest fast food chains said that they were starting to make burgers from cows on a low methane diet. So if you were to see those headlines, you say, okay, this is interesting. This is clearly not just a nice to do or a marketing effort. This something fundamental is going on here. So all of that's happened this month. It's the 29th, we've got a couple more days. One of these things, the Unilever one, I just saw this morning, so I threw that in there, just was announced, is being announced today. But this goes on every month. And it's been going on for years and years, good times and bad, through the last recession, through this pandemic, this horrible moment in recession that we're in, and all the uncertainty. Companies have been moving this forward and making big commitments and putting themselves out there in some significant ways. And as I've seen this over, as I said, 3 decades, we've sort of gone from this world of first, how do we stop the bad stuff, even if it was legal, but just, the smokestacks and the drain pipes and the dumpsters, to how do we improve the bottom line while getting some good reputational points and making our customers and our employees and everybody happy, to not just how do we improve the bottom line, but how do we grow the top line? How does sustainability become an engine for growth and innovation, new products and services? And to where we are now, which is, so how do we not just stop the bad stuff, but how do companies, how does the business sector individually and collectively become a net positive contributor? How does it become more regenerative, taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than it's putting in, taking more waste out of the waste stream, replenishing the water supply so it never gets depleted? So it's just fascinating times. And so we've gone from this era of this business as usual, things that companies did that inadvertently had negative impacts, usually inadvertently, to how do we create positive, deliberately positive impacts? And that's the world that we're in now. And so people always say, well, why are companies doing this? What's the business case? Everybody wants to know what the business case is, as if there was a business case for ruining the planet. And I have an old answer and a new answer for that question. And the old answer is sort of this litany of things that you always see in every company presentation. This is about growing revenue. This is about cutting costs. This is about new products and markets, the ability to attract capital or talent, being a preferred supplier, or of course the reputational stuff, which I always put last because most people out there think that's the one and only reason. That's first. That's the main reason companies are doing these things. But as you'll see, and probably maybe even know, that a lot of what companies are doing, they don't even talk about. This is actually an area where companies are walking more than they're talking. And I'd be happy to talk about that later if you're interested. But that's the old answer, and it's not untrue. But increasingly, that business case boils down to one word: risk. And of course, there's lots of different kinds of risk. There's financial risk and reputational risk, the supply chain for some companies, the litigation risk that somehow what you did, even honestly and inadvertently, is going to end up in court. There's a whole world of stranded assets, including land that may be flood prone, and simply the license to operate for some companies. If you're a large water user, or even a developer that's using a lot of water in a community that's water stressed, you may not be welcome. You may not even be able to do business. And in the developing world, we've actually seen beverage plants getting burned down by people who thought that those plants were polluting the local waterway, when in fact it probably wasn't, but that was the mindset there. So, the risk is certainly true in your world. And there's a study that came out last year that said over a third of real estate investment trust properties are exposed to climate hazards, and 17% around inland floods, 6% sea level rise and coastal floods, and then 12% to hurricanes and typhoons. And I think you all know about the extreme weather part of this. Now I'll get to some other parts, and then one that I know you're going to hear from Catherine at ULI in a little bit, and I don't want to step on her toes, but they had a sort of their own finding about that building for resilience on a portfolio property and citywide basis is going to be key to staying competitive, and factoring in climate risk is part of the new normal in the real estate industry. And of course, the other side of risk is resilience. And resilience is basically the ability to withstand stress, withstand shocks of any kind. Individually, we're resilient when we can come back from sickness or family or divorce or loss of a loved one or a job loss or any number of different calamities that can befall on any one of us. And as a society and as a city and as companies, resilience is key too. And so again, it's the ability to withstand shock, and shocks come in various kinds of economic shocks, public health shocks, terrorism, which includes cyber terrorism, whether it's domestic or foreign, political shocks, and climate shocks. And what's sort of amazing about this list is I've been showing these 5 things for years, talking about risk and resilience. And I realized not too many weeks ago that, wow, we are undergoing all 5 of those right now. That's unprecedented to have. We are running the table on resilience and shocks. And so the need to be resilient is going to grow increasingly as we find ourselves being buffeted by more and more of these kinds of things. So with that as preamble, let's get down to your world a little bit. And what does it mean to be resilient? Well, before I get to that, I want to tell a story. Maybe some of you know this story, but I bet a number of you don't. And it has to do with the town of Greensburg, Kansas, smack dab in the middle of the United States, as you can see on the map below. In May 2007, Greensburg got leveled by a tornado. It's an F5, which is the highest level on the Fujita scale to measure tornadoes. It came through, it leveled 95% of the town and basically made the other 5% unstable. So basically leveled the town. And in the aftermath of, there's a picture of Greensburg right after the tornado. And in the aftermath of that, FEMA came in to work with the townspeople. They didn't actually even have a place to meet, so they brought in these massive circus tents just to have a place. It was summer now in the Midwest. It was kind of warm, and so they brought people in and led them through a series of exercises. And the first one was simply to ask them 3 questions about their community. What do you want to see? What are we gonna rebuild? We're going to rebuild, but what are we gonna rebuild? So they asked 3 questions. They said, what do you love about your community? I think we all have things that we have to say about that. What are the barriers of your community? It's probably a nicer way of saying, what do you not love about your community? And what would you create if you could in your community? And what was remarkable about what came out of that was the answer. And some of those answers were they wanted a community powered by renewable energy with energy efficient buildings, healthy spaces to live and work. They wanted it to be resilient to withstand the next natural disaster. And they wanted a progressive, inclusive town that respected the environment and provided opportunities for young people to live, learn, and work. And I think the context is that Greensburg was a place where young people grew up, went to college, and never came back. So it was one of those towns, and there are many, many of them around the United States that are not dying, but they're withering. And I also think it's important to say, just for context, again, this is Greensburg, Kansas, in Kiowa County, which in the 2016 election went 82% for Donald Trump, only 10% for Hillary Clinton. There's some other in there. I actually looked and saw that it got one vote for Bernie Sanders. So this is not exactly a progressive, let alone radical bastion. This is good plain folks in the middle of America who are looking to get on with their lives. So they came together and created a plan. And the upshot of it is that Greensburg now has the largest per capita number of LEED Platinum buildings. It's designed to capture and recycle water, use geothermal heating and power from its own wind turbine. It also set up invested in a wind farm just outside of town, and so it buys enough renewable energy plus wind credits to claim that it gets 100% of its power from the wind, which ironically is what knocked it down in the first place. And equally, and perhaps paramount here, is that it's now a place where young people want to come back after college. It's a remarkable story. So the point of that is that when you ask people what they want and how they want to live and where they want to live, they will talk about sustainability, even if they don't use that word, even if they don't even know that word or what it means or think they know what it means. They will talk about attributes that we probably would call sustainability. So what does it mean to be resilient these days? Well, if you look at what I found in the real estate industry and the built environment, including the work that that National Association of Realtors is doing with NAHB that I think Vince referred to, it's a lot about the built environment, naturally, around disaster recovery, building codes and standards, construction styles, about looking at sea level rise, that shaky national insurance flood, the national insurance flood program that definitely needs some change, and basically around adaptation and mitigation kinds of things. All good stuff, all critically part of it. But that's only part of the story, because there's also people. And that's the world we're finding ourselves in now, where we start to look at this world where other things, environmental justice, climate justice, economic justice, criminal justice, and racial justice are now very much part of the conversation. They have been around for a long time. These are not new things, but they've become much bigger part of the consciousness and the conversation across political lines, across state lines. And so, you know, and all of that sort of rolls up into this term called social justice. So what is that about, and how does resilience fit into that? Well, again, going back to the people of Greensburg or just anybody you know, social justice involves about, you know, good schools and healthy, affordable, accessible food, the food deserts, eliminating those in certain communities, clean air and water, reliable, clean energy, safety in every sense of the word, affordable housing, safe neighborhoods, access to healthcare, access to mobility, whether it's buses or scooters or just being able to drive without congestion, and a sturdy, reliable infrastructure. That's what resilience is. And that's, by the way, what your clients want. And this is what they've always wanted. These are the kinds of things they always look for. They look for walkability scores now. They look for, obviously, neighborhood safety in schools. I mean, I don't have to tell you what they want. You know that way better than I do. But there is a very strong connection between what we would call sustainability and resilience and just the natural instincts of what people want. So I think we need to get away from this, this simply looking at the environmental part of that. Sustainability, or as I now refer to it, at full spectrum sustainability, it's about much more than the environment. And when you look at how these things that we're facing now come together, the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, and this crisis we're looking around social justice, they all have a lot of things in common. They're all about individual responsibility and collective action. They're around local relevance and context, that what works in Greensburg, Kansas may not work in Chicago or San Francisco. What works in the Northwest may not work in the Southeast. It's about leadership at every level, not just at national or state or even local, but also business leadership and institutional leadership. And it's about really fundamental structural solutions and long-term changes that we have always made in our society, but I think we're going to be seeing a lot more that are specifically referenced to public health, to the climate, and to social justice. So there's also a technology component of this too, which is where we spend a lot of our time at GreenBiz, looking at microgrids and how they enable a much more resilient area. And in those areas now where that Vince was referring to, where they had the fires up in Northern California, microgrids are now becoming a big part of the solution, so that if the grid goes down, that these communities can still operate, or at least critical functions. The Governor Newsom, along with PG&E, are working on building these islands that are also connect to the bigger grid. This is very much part of resilience, not just in fire-prone or disaster-prone areas, but in all parts of the United States now, as the infrastructure, electric infrastructure is less reliable, as the technology enables these kinds of things. Growing food indoors, particularly produce, at these massive indoor farms that are the size of multiple football fields. It can be done on rooftops, can be done on empty lots, it can be done in containers. Growing food at scale locally, by the way, a huge job creation component, but massive technology innovation that's happened. Smart roads that relieve congestion, that look at what's going on in real time and within a city and communicate with vehicles increasingly. The sharing economy, how we have access to more stuff with fewer molecules. Connected mobility systems, so that we can, a friend of mine calls it swinging like Tarzan from vine to vine, to go from car to bus or train to a scooter or bicycle, in whatever form that is, to get from point to point, as opposed to always getting in a car, driving, and getting out of a car. And so how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's connected, that's accessible to everyone? And there's a lot of technology that's enabling that, from apps to a whole range of Internet of Things, connectivity kinds of things. And then the building load flexibility. How do buildings become part of the energy grid, not just as consumers, but as storage devices and producers? And we're seeing a growing ability to use buildings and have flexible loads, and being able to power up and down in small ways that cumulatively can affect the ability and improve the ability of a local, of a city or region to continue having power during peak times in the summer, for example, when everyone's running their air conditioning. So that's sort of a fast and furious look at this. There's lots more technology around this, and lots more innovation happening. And I think that's part of what I want to communicate, that this is a huge area of innovation. But I want to put this all together. When you start to look at all this and you see what's going on in the world of business, and how the intention is going from doing less bad to actually proactively doing good, and how this boils down to questions of risk, and examining what are the risks that we face in the business world, and specifically in the real estate world. What does it mean to be resilient in community, as a business, and how do we interact with our clients in these kinds of ways? And the people part of this, which obviously is what you are all about. You are all about connecting people with homes. But that's a critical part of this that often gets left out of the sustainability conversation. It's not just about buildings and floods and winds. This is obviously about us. And that's what's fascinating about the sustainability conversation, that on the one hand, it's about science and data and really geeky, nerdy stuff that even the scientists don't always agree on. But at the end of the day, this is about us. It's about our bodies. It's about our families. It's about our homes and our communities. And it's about our world. And I think we need to keep that in view. I know that's the world in which you live every day as professionals, but I want to make sure that becomes part of the sustainability conversation. And so as we see this unfold, this is really a fascinating time. And I want to leave you with 3 thoughts in 4 words. First, this is not a drill. This, I think, Vince set this up quite nicely, and I think you know this, but I think it's really important. This is not going to go away, ever. This is in our lifetimes, in our kids' lifetimes, and probably several generations after that. These are going to continue to be issues, and they're going to get worse. The question is, at what point do we really jump in? As we saw with coronavirus, early action, flattening the curve. I mean, there's a climate curve too. And how do we flatten that? And how do we not say this is just something we're dealing with now, and we'll get through this, like hopefully the coronavirus. This is part of our world going forward, as the pandemic will be as well. And so we need to understand this and start to bake this into how we think, how we act, how we plan, how we communicate. And this can be an opportunity. This does not all have to be a, oh my God moment. The world's coming to an end. We need to, to do something. There's opportunities here. There's opportunities for innovation. There's opportunities for influence. There's opportunities for the real estate industry to be influential with its customers, with at the policy level and local cities and building codes, thinking about the need to bring resilience into the conversation and not simply look at development for development's sake as we have in the past, but to be able to think a little bit more long-term. And out of any crisis comes some opportunities, and there certainly are many here, as I said, in terms of innovation and how you do business. And it's critical to be informed and to stay current and to understand all that's going on. As you saw from the very first slide, there's a lot going on in the big business world, and there's a lot more going on at the not just smaller business, but smaller institutions, and particularly at the city level. In fact, the urban level is where the leadership truly is on climate and sustainability in general. The mayors are way ahead of the governors and way ahead of the national government, and so you see leadership, and this is not just in blue states or blue cities. We see it in Indianapolis, we see it in Topeka, we see it in the Southeast and in other parts of the world, of the country, that aren't necessarily connected to progressive thinking or democratic politics. And so I think there's, how do you keep up with what's going on, and how do you find the best of what's going on around the country and around the world and bring that to your community? So 4 words. My favorite questions in the world of sustainability all begin with the same 4 words. What would it take? And the rest of that question can be any number of things, and it speaks to your level. It can be from the personal to the planetary, but what would it take to make sustainability part of your business strategy, to contribute to community resilience? What would it take to use sustainability as a marketing advantage, or to be seen as a responsible player in the community, or to align with this moment, this incredible, horrifying moment in our history? And, again, these are just 5 questions that I pulled up here that may be relevant to you, but really my question that I want to leave you with is, what's your what would it take question? Because it's through that, it's through asking those questions. And again, it could be around your own personal career, it could be around your community, it could be around the planet. But what's your what would it take question? That's where the conversation starts. That's where we look, you can sort of assess your own ambition, vision, questions, concerns. And I think that's a really important way that I want you to take anything from here. What would you like to see happen? What's the change you want to see in the world? And then, of course, how do you become part of that? And I don't mean that as just a feel-good throwaway line. This is really about, as I said, individual responsibility and collective action. So what do you want to do individually? What do you want to do collectively as an association and as an industry? What's your what would it take question? Thank you for considering that, for having this conversation, for being here today, for your concerns and questions and interest in sustainability. And most of all, thank you so much for your kind attention. And with that, hand it back to Eileen.
Thank you, Joel. This is a lot to unpack. This is a lot to unpack in just a half hour. We could spend probably a day or two, especially answering that question, what would it take? However, NAR has definitely taken the bull by the horns by doing the Sustainability Action Plan, having the Sustainability Advisory Group to be a leader in this space. And I just happened to be watching, well, not just happening watching TV. Judge Judy is kind of like my drug of choice when it comes to my guilty pleasure. And one of the commercials was about Amazon and their commitment to the environment. And they have the climate pledge, Paris 10 years early. So they're committed to reducing their carbon footprint, going net zero, 100% renewable energy by 2025. They're purchasing 100,000 electric vehicles. And as they're investing 100 million in reforestation projects, among other things that they're doing. And I like what you said about that this is not a drill, especially that we are being confronted on 5 fronts: the economic, public health, public safety, our political environment, and especially extreme weather events. So I think that you bring but I appreciate how you bring it home to how is this going to affect our business? And that now that the majority of us are working from our home, we're hyper aware of what's happening in there. And I think what the people of Greenburgh really honed in on, they just want a safe and sound, comfortable home. And that's what we as NAR, what we're trying to communicate to our members, is that we're here to help you achieve that, and especially safe and sound communities. So I do have a question from Craig Foley, our immediate past chair of the Sustainability Advisory Group and chair of the PAG. He asked, how did Greenburgh fund that recovery? We had your co-author of the Grand Strategy, Patrick Doherty, as one of his first summit speakers. I know that he spoke a lot about public-private partnerships for funding resiliency. Can you give NAR some suggestions on how we might be able to further public-private partnerships on resiliency and green funding?
So specifically, how do you fund it? Is that what you're asking, or how do you have a public-private partnership? I'm unclear what.
Craig, do you want to elaborate? You can just take yourself on mute, off mute. You could do it, or I can do it for you.
No, I got it. There you go. Thanks, Elaine. Joel, thank you. The great remarks, really helpful for our trade organization. But Greensburg in particular, how they funded that event. But perhaps more importantly, how can NAR, our trade organization, which carries so much influence, how can we better position ourselves to help public-private partnerships? What can we do to be part of a solution here, particularly when it comes to the funding mechanisms, both down to the individual homeowner, but at the community level as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a huge need for policy shifts, and that happens at every level. But ideally at the national level, but also at the state level. And that goes to how do we invest in mitigation technologies. Obviously coastal flooding, there's a lot that do around revitalizing coastal wetlands, mangrove swamps in the south, forests and other things. And what are the rewards financially, tax credits or any other things that come out of that? We still have a lot of perverse incentives in our building codes and in the standards that we use to design communities and buildings. And some of those have just been things we've done for a long, long time. Example, there are some developers who are building either communities or small or neighborhoods. And they want to make, as walkability becomes more and more of a factor in green space, they want to make small winding streets than big straight ahead thoroughfares. But the codes don't allow that in some places because of what fire trucks need to get through it quickly. And that's a genuine concern. I don't mean for a second to say that we need to ignore that, but how do we work with that? There's smaller fire trucks, there's other kinds of things. So how do we think about aligning those interests as opposed to just doing what we've already been done? There's a big role to play in changing the rules of the game, because the rules of the game do not, well, they got us where we are, where we've overbuilt and under-resourced natural resources. There's places that don't have enough water, new communities don't have enough water. There's obviously the traffic congestion. There's lots of incentives, perverse incentives they're called, incentives to do the wrong thing, incentives that require parking in apartment buildings as opposed to saying, well, maybe we don't need to require so many parking spaces. Maybe we can make accommodations for transit and give, credits for certain kinds of other adoptions. LEED does some of that, but there's a lot further you can go, and some of that's stymied by local code. So I think if I were, to pick one thing that I would want to see the industry do, it is get more involved with policy through the lens of what's needed from a sustainability perspective. And some of that goes also to, well, how do we, first of all, protect areas that are vulnerable and people in neighborhoods that are vulnerable, but also what's the infrastructure bank, which we've created in the past, that can fund not just recovery of disasters, which we need to do, but also, as the meme these days goes, build back better. How do we create the funds so that whether they're guaranteeing investments or subsidizing interest rates, there's so many mechanisms that are way beyond my pay scale. But I think that's where the industry has an opportunity to look a little bit further in its own interests than its own interests in terms of what does it take to stimulate and accelerate housing sales and home ownership in a given community. Nothing wrong with that at all. Did I mention I'm the son of a realtor? But there's more to it than that. And I think we need to be able to look a little bit more broadly, a little bit more holistically, a little bit more systemically.
Thank you, Joel. We have another question from Ken Poitius of Traverse, Michigan, AE extraordinaire. He says, how do we get more baby boomers to adopt these methods when their time horizon is only 15 to 20 years?
Why baby boomers? I mean, I'm one, but why are you focusing on them? I mean, we're terming out in the marketplace. I mean, we're moving from our big homes and empty nesting into sometimes in the from the suburbs into the city or other kinds of housing. But why them as opposed to Gen X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what's behind that question.
Kim, do you want to answer that?
Hi, Joel. This is Kim Pontius, and the point behind that question is we see a lot of retirees moving into our region, baby boomers, early retirees, probably in the 55 to 65 year range. When we try to talk about sustainability or resilience to this population, again, their time horizon on this planet is probably 15 to 20 years. And their attitude is, I moved here because it's a beautiful place. I just want to be left alone. I don't want to think about what the next 50 to 100 years looks like. I'm not going to be around and I don't care. And I will tell you, in having conversations with members, not just mine, but at national meetings, especially older members, I get that same thing. It's kind of like, I know this is important, but I'm not going to be around to see it. Maybe my kids or grandkids, but it's not something that I can get behind. And honestly, I'm a believer, I'm a boomer. And I believe that it's up to us to start to have this conversation and make people realize, hey, we made a lot of mistakes along the way. We're trying to take a look at how we can correct those mistakes and move forward in a more positive way. But we're the voice. We're still the voice right now. It's not yet the millennials' point. Gen X is not, quite carrying the freight. But I think the boomers need to leave a legacy. And that legacy is, look, we're trying to fix what we did wrong and we're trying to make it better going forward. There just aren't enough of us doing it because, again, we have this short time horizon. And I guess, I don't know, maybe we don't think it's important enough. But climate change isn't waiting on us. I think about everything that Craig has talked about at our other summits. And it's like, we got till 2030 to start figuring out some solutions. That's not a big time window for coming up with some time solutions. And by 2050, we're pretty well committed. So if we don't start making some aggressive changes now, particularly in the boomers, I just don't think that we're going to get there. And I think we're going to leave a real bad situation for the millennials and the Gen Zs and those that come later. That's the point behind my comment.
Yeah, I know we're, you need to, very much out of time, so I'll make it quick. But first of all, on behalf of your generation and mine, Kim, we're sorry, everybody. I mean, apologies, deep apologies. It's frustrating because the boomer generation, at least a good chunk of it, grew up during a time of other social upheaval. The whole environmental movement was born on our watch, largely because of a lot of us. I mean, I was a senior in high school during the first Earth Day, and so I remember it clearly. I was very much a part of that. The obvious question is, do they have kids and grandkids and expect there to be future generations? Because I think that's, to the extent you can engage them, I think it's going to be at that level. But I would submit that, sadly, tragically, we kind of have to write boomers off. It's really hard in general to take someone who is so dead set against any of these kinds of things, who are so invested in their self-interest, in their own life, and don't really want to be a part of any other discussions. It's really hard to convince them, and I don't try. It's futile and frustrating, and it's usually end all that well. So I think I would really focus on I would sort of write them off in a sort of crude to say, but genuine way. And, because the generations behind them, I mean, I have an office full of millennials, about 30 of them, and I learn stuff from them every day. And they would, I think, violently disagree at your comment that the boomers are still, I forget the word you used, but still dominant. And so they are rising, and in many cases, increasingly in charge. And their voice is speaking very loudly, as you can see on the streets today and for the last couple of months. So I think we have to engage that next generation and say, the older generations are something of a lost cause if they're not into it by now, if they don't understand the existential nature of climate change, of the pandemic, frankly, of social injustice. If you don't get that and understand that things have to change, it's kind of too late for you. I mean, I really don't feel great saying this, but it's the honest truth. So I would focus on the next generations, the people who do get it. And to the extent you do want to focus, find those champions who are boomers, who do get it, and who do have an appetite to have conversations. Mm-hmm. It's important to meet people where they are. What's of concern to you? Is it your health? Is it your retirement fund? Is it this great place that you've chosen to spend the last few years of your life? What is it? Let's start there and work with something. So I know we're out of time. I'm going to stop there. And it's a great question and a very challenging and probably frustrating answer. But thank you again.
Thank you, Joel. It was very enlightening, and it is a question. But I think that we're realizing that we can coexist. The air is better. We're not using as much waste. We are a disposable society. We're just a consuming society. But I think this pandemic, working from home, has made us realize that we can coexist. But the question also reminds me of a Chinese proverb that goes something like, "When is the best time to plant a tree?" And it was. The first answer is 20 years ago. The next best time is now. So I think that, you can teach an old dog new tricks, and going outside and having beautiful air and clean water is definitely changing a lot of people's perspectives. So thank you, Joel, for your insight. We really appreciate it. Next, we are bringing on Dr. Jessica Louts. I'm so excited. I do stalk Dr. Jessica. She has incredible information and great stats. She's the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights at the National Association of Realtors. The core of her research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Through management of surveys, focus groups, and data analysis, she presents new and innovative ways to showcase results. Jessica discusses research findings in major media outlets and international presentations. She received her doctorate of real estate from, I'm going to pronounce this right because I have a British husband, Nottingham, not Nottingham, Nottingham, Trent University in the UK. She also has a master's in public policy from American University and undergraduate degrees in political science and law and justice from Central Washington University. She, in shortening that up, she's super smart and super entertaining. And please let us welcome Dr. Jessica Lautz.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be here with you guys today. Yeah, in summary, I have a lot of student loan debt and I'm working on that. So that's a 2020 pandemic goal for me. So I'm going to start sharing my slides right now and hopefully we can all see them a-okay. All right, so I put a lot of data here together that has to do with sustainability, with energy efficiency, with what consumers are looking for. A lot of the data that we have, it's pre-pandemic, but we know that COVID is really changing the way that we live, what we want from our homes, who we're living with, perhaps. So when I go through this data, I'm going to go through what we've already seen as trends and then talk about the continuation of trends and perhaps what we really do see the fast forward button on and how COVID could be changing all of this. I want to give a backdrop though first, because sustainability doesn't happen in a vacuum. No housing trends happen in a vacuum. They happen within the environment that we're in. And so when we talk about the data, I want to say first that we saw a pause in the housing market, and we saw that for a couple of months as there were lockdown measures that happened, some states stricter than others. And so we know that some buyers said, you know what, I'm going to take a moment here and not go through with my housing transaction and take a pause in the market in the spring. We also saw that some sellers said, you know what, I don't know how to list my home in the market in this environment. I don't feel comfortable. But quickly members pivoted, they changed their business practices, and people felt more comfortable coming back into the market. And we're seeing that in the data today. Today, literally just a couple of hours ago, pending home sales was released. And what it showed is a continuation of a trend of increases in month-to-month contract activity. So we're seeing these buyers come back into the market. We're seeing sellers relist their homes. And so when we look at the housing landscape today, what we see is that just last week we released existing home sales, so closed contract activity, and we saw historic gains in monthly increases. And all of that is driving very low time on market. In some areas, we're really talking about a day that a home is listed before it goes under contract. And all of that is really driving this unprecedented year-over-year home price growth. So we have 100 months of year-over-year home price growth. We've never seen that in the market before, as long as we've been collecting data back to the 1960s. 9 in 10 members are saying that their market is in a point of recovery. I'll give you a little insight. We're collecting data right now, and we're seeing that people are saying that it's the hottest market that they've seen. Some of them historically, they've never seen this type of market before, especially during July. We haven't seen this before. And so we are seeing really a spring market in the heat of summer as this has heated up. All of this being said, what this is creating is an inventory crisis, because people who paused their home sale transaction, they're now coming back into the market. But people who were stuck in their homes and saying, I can't make this home work for me, and the long term, I definitely need a different place to live, are also entering the market. So all of these potential buyers are out there searching for this beautiful place to live that'll fit all of their needs and having a very difficult time doing it. So a lot of multiple contract situations. And so what this means for sustainability is that we have a lot of people saying, members saying, there is a strong consumer interest in sustainability. Potential buyers want an energy efficient home, someplace that will reduce their cost in their home so that they don't necessarily have to pay for expensive heating and cooling costs, and they can have an energy efficient footprint in their home. But the number one most difficult task that's holding buyers back from the market today is the lack of inventory. So these two interests are really meeting head to head, and you don't necessarily get your entire wish list if you're just searching for this right home in this right neighborhood to fit all of you and your family's needs. And so this is really something that is not necessarily a new issue, but it is an issue that we are facing under even more pressure today than we have in the past. When we look at the value of energy efficiency in listings, absolutely, there's value. If you start promoting that in your home listing, you're going to see value, because there's going to be buyers out there who are saying, this is the top of the list. Not only do I want to be in this right neighborhood, in the right school district for my kids, commute time, we'll go into that a little deeper in a second, changing that up, but we are seeing that this is important because it's not only a pocketbook. So when we talk about writing off boomers, I have to think at the end of the day, they do care about money. And so looking at how we can get them involved and how we can have them in the conversation, having a conversation about what is the cost of a home, especially when affordability is such a constraint right now, that suddenly becomes one of the important values. So even if it's not something about caring about the earth and caring about our environment, if it's the pocketbook, sometimes you can get people involved. When we look at what buyers want, we actually see that 7 in 10 actually say that it's at least somewhat important for the heating and cooling systems within their home to be environmentally friendly, to have energy efficient windows and doors, lighting, appliances. More than half, and not an insignificant number, are even saying landscaping, community features, things like solar panels. We started collecting that just a few years ago, and we can see that slowly climbing as actually important to some buyers. So we're not quite at 1 in 10 yet, but we are seeing this actually rise in importance as people are saying, oh, wow, this is great. I can have this type of feature. Maybe I don't even have to own it. I can lease this. And this is something that can really actually contribute to not only an environmentally friendly feature, but it also contributes to my pocketbook. That being said, the typical home that was purchased was more than 30 years old. So again, we're talking about a very older housing inventory in the US that may not have these features that were initially installed in that property. When we look at buyers today in the Northeast, they're actually typically purchasing a home that was built in the 1970s. So that really is talking about an older property. And I have to say, the type of home that's being purchased varies dramatically by the income of the buyer and the affordability that the buyer is able to enter the market with. So when we look at this, the biggest segment of buyers today is millennials. So everything, when we talk about millennials and this avocado toast eating generation, they're actually out there buying homes as a force too. And we have to remember that the millennial generation, it ranges from 25 to 40. So when we talk about this, we're talking about a very large span of ages. So there's a lot of pretense put on millennials, but they do seem to really care about the environment. And this is not just millennials. It also is the generation that comes after them, the Zoomers, the Gen Z, whatever we're going to call them, the Zennials that come next, also important to them. What happens with millennials, though, is that they often are cash strapped, often because of student loan debt, having a harder time entering the housing market. And so they tend to purchase older homes, which do not come with all these bells and whistles and do not come with energy efficiency. So when we look at this data, this I think is a really interesting chart. So this is the age of the home that was purchased. So not the age of the buyer, just how old is the home? Homes that were built in 2019 and 2018, the buyers of those homes say, yes, energy efficiency is incredibly important to them because they're buying these new homes. This is something that really they need to have an energy efficient footprint. This is important to them. They have the ability to purchase and the wealth perhaps to purchase this newer built property, which does come at a price point. For homes that were built even 2012 through 2017, still really important when we look at the energy efficiency. And then it kind of wanes after that. When we start thinking about people who are purchasing homes that were built in 1984, 58, then perhaps the energy efficiency is less important. So I don't want to put words in Joel's mouth, but perhaps that's where we get the baby boomers there. We can just write them off. All right, so then we go to the homes that are older. And who's purchasing the older homes? Again, these millennials who are often cash strapped are purchasing these older homes. Now, if you are living in a home that's 100 years old, you probably need to update some of the things within your home, presumably. And so as people do take on remodeling projects, they're often taking on energy efficiency along with that. So thinking about upgrading your HVAC and actually making it more energy efficient. But also it's perhaps the buyer who's purchasing this home and how important are these features within it. So there's an interesting dynamic that's going on here that even buyers who purchase extremely old homes are actually saying, this is important to me. This may not be in the home, but it is important to me. When we look at the typical home that was purchased by the age of the buyer, typical younger millennial is purchasing a home that was built in 1978. So very likely could be upgrading these features within the home, even though they're not in the newest property. One of the things that does happen when we talk about millennials is they're often compromising on the condition of the home, but they're also very, very likely to DIY projects. We did an entire report about this, and they want to customize the features within their homes, and they want to be able to tackle this with elbow grease. So they may have these really high expectations from binge watching a lot of TV shows right now about remodeling, or perhaps having that perfect gray paint when they go in this perfectly staged home. But they're also willing to actually take on some of these projects within their home. And we know right now that Home Depot, Lowe's, all of these remodeling stores are doing extremely well. And in fact, half of members are saying that their potential clients are saying, how do I remodel my home? How do I take on these projects? And I'm sure that energy efficiency is one of those components in that. When we look at millennials today, one of the other things that is happening is that a quarter of them are purchasing in small towns. And I'm going to talk about this neighborhood dynamic, but I think this also becomes very interesting because this may not be where the newest housing stock is, which often is in suburban areas, often in the South, in the Midwest, where we do, or in the West, where we do see newer properties being built. So where millennials are purchasing, where this strong interest in this energy efficiency is maybe not where these types of properties are located. When we look at the top remodeling projects for energy efficiency, we've done a report on this. What we find is for people who have tackled remodeling projects, when they look at the reasons why they tackle them, so maybe there is nothing wrong with their HVAC, but they just want to replace it. And one of the top reasons on doing that is for more energy efficiency, especially when we think about winter months, summer months. Those become extremely important to look at types of features within your home. And then if you replace your HVAC, you certainly don't want all that energy going outside. So replacing the windows and doors. And then also that insulation upgrade. Not necessarily going to bring a buyer into your home that you have nice upgraded insulation, but you're certainly going to feel that in the summer and the winter. And we know for consumers who took on that project, that's the top reason why. All right, so I've talked a lot about pre-COVID, but I think it's important to talk about where we are now and perhaps where we're going in the future. When we look at the housing landscape today, I'm going to dive into some of these things, but what we see is that already members are reporting that 35% of consumers are changing up the home features that they're searching for. A quarter of members cite that they're changing up the location that people are buying in. So looking more towards these small towns, this continuation of this trend, looking more towards rural areas or outer suburbs. And then also there's a shift towards even people who are looking before pre-pandemic to now, that 13% have changed where they're looking for, and now they're looking for the single family home, different footprint. So I think this becomes a very interesting dynamic, and I'm going to dive into some of these. So when we look at the home features that people are looking for, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised. Home office, number one. And again, this is a very passe thing to say because no one cared about the home office after the invention of the laptop. Because you can sit on your couch, you can sit at the kitchen table, you can sit on your back patio. Who cares where you're working because you're working with your laptop? And now everyone needs a door. Trust me, I have 4 cats, and at any point, one of them will jump up here and throw my laptop on the floor. I need a door. When we look at this, we see that it's not just one home office, it's often 2 home offices for spouses working at home together or partners. But we also are starting to hear rumblings now with schools of perhaps they need 3 home offices because you have to have your kids in another room because you can't do any work. And they need to be doing their own home office. We also hear about this overcrowding within your own space. So space within your own home, thinking about that and accommodating another family member. And I'm going to dig into that a little more. But also perhaps the density of the neighborhood. So thinking about just more space as your outdoor space as well. So space to grow your own fruits and vegetables, a yard for exercise, acreage, a pool, all thinking about outdoor spaces and how important that is right now. And then you need a kitchen to be able to can all these fruits and vegetables that I guess you're growing. We absolutely see this now. And this trend, we started asking about this in May. And by June, these are the figures that we're already getting back. In May, we weren't near the figures that we have now. And I suspect we're at the end of July that if we ask this again, we'd actually see these even higher. There seems to be not only a personal preference towards a less dense neighborhood, so not thinking about these dense city blocks, but also thinking about the overcrowding for your personal spaces in your home. And both of these are contributing factors to people going and purchasing today and actually changing up this. When we think about this 15% who are looking for this space, for this extra family member in the home, I want to dig into that because I think it becomes really interesting from what we've seen in the past and then what I think we could see in is the acceleration of this trend. We had seen that 1 in 6 Gen Xers and younger boomers purchased a multi-generational home. So thinking about an older adult relative, an adult child who's boomeranged back or perhaps never left, all living within a shared space and this large single family home. I suspect that this is only going to increase. We're seeing that already pop out in the numbers that people are saying, my older adult relative was in a senior center living situation. I want to bring them in. What does this mean for energy efficiency? There's a lot of things I think that can contribute here. One is you're going to need a larger property to be able to accommodate everyone. You're going to have to find that perfect neighborhood that's going to be able to fit everyone's needs. Perhaps this invention of tiny homes and ADUs will be more common in rural areas where people seem to be moving to, but also thinking about a footprint within that home and then also the technology and things that could make that easier in perhaps these older properties. So this all becomes a very connected way of living when we think about everything that you need within that home to accommodate this older adult relative who may have been in a senior living situation. The next trend, what I'm going to show you is something that there's been a lot of fodder about, a lot of jokes made. I'm not necessarily sure we're going to see it, but I'll leave it out there for you all to think about as something that we could see moving forward. Is there's been a lot of talk about a potential baby boom with pandemic babies, coronavirus babies, COVID babies, whatever you want to call them, and that we could have this large kindergarten class come 5 years from now, 6 years from now, that does have a lot of children who are pandemic babies. What I want to say, though, is that we have more than a 30-year drop in birth rates in the country, and a lot of this stems from finances. So when we look at home buyers today, those who had children under the age of 18 in their home, when we look at home buyers back in the 1980s, nearly 60% of buyers had children under the age of 18, and today it's just 35%. I don't necessarily know. I guess I'm a little more skeptical of this trend that we're going to see this big baby boom coming out of this. And the reason why is that a lot of this has to do with finances. And a lot of the reason why we have this baby bust is because people can't afford childcare in the country. So the people who have traditionally and have lost their jobs currently with the pandemic are millennials. And so we see a larger share of millennials who have lost their employment through no fault of their own. And so I think this will be a curious trend. We heard a lot of fodder. There's not going to be any second babies in the pandemic, only first babies. Maybe we'll have a generation of only children. I'm not entirely sure. But all of this also contributes to the footprint of the home, but also where people will end up wanting to live. Another trend that I think we could see out of this is the year of the roommate. We've already seen coming into this that the highest share of buyers purchased homes this year as first-time home buyers who have a roommate, and then also the highest share of unmarried couples as first-time home buyers purchased a home this year. I think that these trends will continue as people have been at home by themselves and want to change up their living situation and say, I can't live by myself anymore. I don't care if this is a long-term situation or not, but perhaps I purchased my home with a roommate right now, a sibling, a cousin, etc., or as an unmarried couple, not committed to marriage, but perhaps committed to purchasing that home because I don't want to be by myself. I think this is a trend that could happen as we watch this moving forward, because people, it's difficult being by yourself. The other trend that I think we will see a continuation of is fur babies as roommates. So we have already seen that there has been a complete clearing of shelters in the country. People have adopted pets as companionship, but also as something to entertain your kid. And so I think that we could absolutely see that this is a continuation of trend. What this does mean when you look at these properties to purchase is that there's a lot of people who are actually choosing to buy a home because they have a new pet. There's a lot of people who change their living situation and keep their pet in mind. And suddenly things like walking trails, a fenced yard, become very important to pet owners when they may not have been at the top of the list before. So I've talked a lot about things within the home and about neighborhood choice, but one of the things that I think is also really important to talk about in this COVID environment is the commute. Doesn't matter. And so when we talk about the neighborhood and we talk about this desire to be in these rural areas, one of the things that could happen is that you really could open up affordability suddenly for younger people, for entry-level buyers who may not have been able to afford a property before. Now with low interest rates, they're looking at a completely different area in a more rural location, and they don't have to go to work into a physical office as much as they had to before. So we've asked members about the commute time. What we do see is nearly a quarter saying that buyers are less concerned with their commute. They have a stronger preference to be near bike trails, connect to work, care more about parking. So thinking about having their own car and taking their car to work maybe once a month, once a week, but not on a frequent basis. That need to be closer to public transit. There has been a big move away from public transit. Obviously with COVID, people are very concerned about being in close spaces in public areas, and so that shift away. Again, this is not good for sustainability, but it is a big change. And perhaps if everyone's just in their cars less, that does contribute in a positive way moving forward. In the past, commute had been a top factor for buyers out there. They had said that absolutely, especially working age, young adults, saying that this is a top factor in where I live, and the most important factor in the neighborhood choice, and have been very important. So once you hit retirement, less so, but this had been such a strong factor that I think it really could open up the American dream of homeownership. A lot of people had felt shut out in these strong, dense metro areas that unfortunately they couldn't afford or couldn't find a property within their price point. So things to watch, things that I've been thinking about, things that I think could happen, things that I've heard fodder from realtors, tiny homes on land. So if people are used to living within these dense condos, dense apartments in city centers, thinking about the space that they just need outside of their home, the fresh air that they want, perhaps they don't care about how large that home is. They don't necessarily care about that single family property. They just want a space, and they want to be able to have their own space. So tiny homes on land, we could see a sudden desire for these types of properties. Vacation homes, less good broadband equals a primary residence, who knows? If you can't go on an international vacation and you have the income and you can see the low interest rates, and you can see the affordability in rural areas, maybe you keep that primary residence, you purchase that vacation home you've never planned on purchasing before, and if you have good broadband access, maybe that becomes your primary home in the future. A lot of places, a lot of realtors are saying, rural West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Idaho, Michigan, so looking at lake country, and then also looking at just the desire to be there if you have the good broadband. Also thinking about the reinvention of rural areas. What happens if there's this huge swarm of people who are suddenly moving there? What does that mean? We've already seen that older millennials, Gen Xers, have reinvented suburban living. And I say that kind of in air quotes. They perhaps like to think they reinvented urban living, or suburban living, but they have these town centers with parks in between and sculptures where their kids can play, walkable between restaurants, even being able to take drinks between restaurants in some of these areas and have this walkable shopping. What happens to rural areas? Do these types of developments pop up, or do we have just the joy and the pure outdoorness that rural areas have provided always? What will happen? And then what happens with schools? In the next couple of weeks, a lot of Americans traditionally have needed to come home from vacation next month, have their kids back in school. But if that doesn't come into play and your kid can go remote anywhere, doesn't matter. And what will happen there? So I think that these are some things for fodder, but I do think it's an interesting time in America to watch these trends. So thank you so much for having me. I think this is a great topic and a very interesting time.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica. That was a lot of information for us to take in. And from personal experience, I was showing homes recently, and I was walking up the stairs, and we went into a room that had beautiful natural light, and it was kind of separated from the rest of the house. And I thought, oh my gosh, this would be a great Zoom room. And it reminded me of when I grew up in the 80s, and I loved MTV Cribs. And one of my favorite rooms for them to get to was the boom boom room. And so I think everybody wanted the garage. The men wanted the garage. They wanted to see that. They wanted to see the boom boom room. And I thought, this is like our new future. Our future is the Zoom room and having great broadband. So I have to say that I want to bring this information to Women's Council California. I'm the president there. And I think that all of them would just love to have this new conversation with our clients, because it is changing. Are you working from home? How long do you need? Are you worried about a commute? How do you entertain yourselves now? And I think how close they want to be to walking trails, now we have the data. So we do have a question. I need to get to it. Here we go. How can realtors assist or provide information to these young buyers who are buying older homes and taking on energy efficient projects? 70% of our housing stock is probably built 1970s or earlier. And so this is one thing that we as green designees and now our real estate professionals will need to have this conversation too. And so how do we start that? How do we start that conversation?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you all as practitioners probably honestly have better advice than I can give on this. I purchased an older home myself, so a long list of contractors that you can call when everything goes wrong, and it certainly does, is certainly helpful, but also being aware of the upfront costs. So if it's a cash-strapped millennial who's concerned about affordability, just knowing, if this system breaks, this is really what it means to you at the end of the day. And how can I do this either myself and start taking courses on it? How can I do this more sustainably? Do I want a DIY project? I think those are some of the conversations to be had. But honestly, you guys probably have better advice on that than I do.
Well, this is definitely a team effort. Having someone like you that crunches the numbers and put these stats together for us is an incredible tool. It really is. So we thank you for that. Does anyone else have a question for here we go. John Rosher says, we in Austin have properties that have a home music recording studios now being sought after and repurposed for webcasting studios. So that may be a question in the future. Are these soundproof? Because right now, my husband has a leaf blower in the backyard, and so that may be a great question for the future: is how important is a soundproof Zoom room for you? So and also the multi-generational is probably more important than ever.
Yeah, those open concepts may have been a thing of the past. I think we all are reconsidering how many doors we have and where we can do quiet work right now.
Yes, not disturbed by a cat or a dog or children and treats. And maybe we need to have one of those signals on the door saying, mommy's working. If you want something from mom or dad, you need to text us. And so,
yes, unless you actually are bleeding, like you're fine.
Exactly. So Craig Foley makes a comment, great data on consumers, Jessica, and the new environment we find ourselves in. Has NAR research polled real estate professionals not only on how COVID has affected their business, but any numbers on how increased intensity of extreme weather events has affected their businesses as well? If so, has that changed over time?
So we do have some research that we have done on flood. We don't have a ton of research on all of the extreme weather events, but I know that we have data on topical research on this, and I'll find some blog links and put them into the chat here as well, because we have dug into this topic.
Fantastic. And I do want to make a comment about the chat. If you have questions for Joel or for Dr. Jessica or for Stuart Pratt, our next speaker, please put them in the chat so we can continue the conversation. So even though they're not the present speaker, we do want to address all of your questions because we have a limited amount of time. So we have one question, and then we have somebody that like to go off mute. So Jacqueline Toole, she says, is there a desire for specific green features increasing in your recent surveys?
So when we look at that, I have that list of different green features. What we see is that many of them are very consistent over time. The one that has increased is a new one that we added, which was that solar panels. We used to see that like 1-2%, but we have seen an increase in that. So I think as things become more popular, but there's also things that don't even make it onto the survey. So things like the Nest thermostat or different types of thermostats like that. They're small upgrades that people can make in their home, but they can save money at the end of the month and just make that small change that really does become popular among consumers.
Agreed. My husband and I, we do live in a small home. It's about 1,200 square feet. Our electricity bill is less than $100 most of the year, and we do not have solar panels on the home. So there are definitely small changes you can make. So Todd Shipman, before we go to the break, he wants to chime in here, the OG Sustainability Advisory Group Chair. Todd?
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So just a quick note, I live in Minneapolis, just a few blocks from where George Floyd was killed. And we have lived through a lot of upheaval, as have other communities in the country. And they're seeing a lot of challenges, in proactive demonstrating and proactive legislation. But an interesting thing, the Minneapolis Area Association of Realtors has a research scientist on staff. We just published a report this week that talking about are people fleeing Minneapolis, and the results are no. Home sales are still strong. We have a lot of things about this community that are valuable to the people that live here. Our culture is strong. And also the city is a very strong proponent for sustainability. And so we have a strong sustainability plan for the city. I think it's good news, and I'm glad to hear it. And if anybody's interested in that report, I can share it with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Todd. If you want, you can share it in the chat, and so we can download it from there. That'd be spectacular.
Thank you.
So I want to thank a few people. I want to thank Amanda Stinton, our staff, amazing, magical staff that we have. Amanda, Russell Riggs, and Hugh Morris. Not only are they talented, but they're also committed to sustainability and the green movement. You could feel their passion when we've been having these meetings. And we're a very unusual group because we do not have a committee liaison. We report directly to leadership. So we report directly to Vince Malta, which is always an enjoyable experience. So let's take a break, and we will rejoin each other at 12 well, for me it's 12:40, or for you it's 12:40 for some part. Well, the 40 minute of the hour. How about that? Let's reconvene, take a break, stretch, do our yoga, get a cup of tea, cup of coffee, and let's continue this conversation. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Let's quietly hand
So
in.
it's break time. Can we talk to each other?
That's a good idea.
That's a good question. We have 1 minute.
I want to know when lunch is being delivered.
Does your Grubhub driver have one of those apps where you can see how close they are?
Hey,
Hello,
John.
John. How are you?
Hey, John Shipman. Good to see you.
Good to see you, man. I got a question for you. You're not washing your face during COVID, or what's going on? What's happening there?
It's the camera. It just adds
it's a
color.
glare. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of us have COVID beards, Kimberly Pontius.
Actually, I texted Hugh Morris and said his beard vacated his face and found its way to you and me, John.
Yeah. Did have a good one.
Yeah.
Looks good on you, though, man. I like it.
Great.
All right. Eileen, it's 12:40. Should we recommence?
Let's recommence. I
So
think
we
that's
have to go back on mute now?
We have to go back on mute, everybody. Great, and I see that, oh, Jessica is, thank you, Jessica, for putting all of these reports and links in the chat. And small little housekeeping here. If you want to save the chat, you just need to click on the bubble chat, and you will find in the bottom right-hand corner, depending on what device you are on, there is three little dots that if you click on that more, and you're able to save the chat. So little Zoom housekeeping. So it is now 40 minutes after the hour, and Central Time, 12:40 Central Time. I do want to give a very, very special shout out to our Vice Chair, Georgia Meacham. She is a staple in NAR. She is an incredible Vice Chair and so knowledgeable about NAR and its operations, and such an enthusiastic leader. I've learned so much from her, and I feel like we're the dream team for the Sustainability Advisory Group. Just an incredible, a yin to my yang, and so thrilled to have her as part of the team. So now I'm going to introduce Stuart Pratt. He came to us when we were actually able to meet in February for the PAG, for the Sustainability Action Plan, and his data was eye-opening. It was so robust and intriguing. And he's part of CoreLogic, which is a $1.8 billion data and analytics company headquartered in my hood, Irvine, California. He leads the company's public policy and business unit engagements with US and foreign governments. He also oversees the company's liaison and research programs with academic institutions, think tanks, consumer groups, and trade associations like ours. Reporting to the CEO, Pratt advises him on enterprise-wide reputational policy and risk issues. As a member of the company's operating committee, he contributes to the company's design and execution of its strategic and annual business plans. Previously, Pratt served as president and CEO of the Consumer Data Industry Association. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Housing Policy Council and the Consumer Data Industry Association. So he is jam-packed, just like Dr. Jessica, with lots of facts and figures that I know you will find fascinating. So please welcome Stuart Pratt.
Okay. Eileen, thanks for that intro. I'm just going to do a spot check on sound. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are. You sound great.
And the screen share is working?
It is working, yes.
I've found it's best to ask that at the beginning. So, well, listen, Eileen, it's good to see you again, at least virtually. And I'm looking forward to my house with a Zoom room in it somewhere down the road. But I think, Vince, your thoughts first thing this morning were incredibly compelling. You know, $400 billion in losses associated with, the 10 most recent major events. Our data and data across the entire scientific community suggests that natural hazard events are occurring more frequently, and they're more frequently more severe. And they're having great, and for those reasons, having much greater impacts on local communities across the United States. I really applaud the NAR for getting out in front of this dialogue on resilience. It is a hard topic to deal with here in Washington, D.C. I will tell you that my wife, who is a realtor, I want you all to know that you're asking your own trade association the right question, which is, and it was a question that was asked, I think, in the context of Joel's presentation, really had to do with what can we do? Well, you all are an incredibly powerful trade association in Washington. You are a powerful voice at the grassroots level across the United States. And it's my own view that realtors are really at the center point of a housing market which is successful, sustainable, fair, and resilient. And really, I think those are all key building blocks that you contribute. I've never bought a house without a realtor. I don't think I ever will. You're that North Star that helps me make the right decision in the right neighborhood at the right time. So today's presentation, you would think it's going to be unequivocally just a giant data dump of science and analytics. And I do have some science and data for you towards the back end of the deck of slides today. But this is also a presentation. I just want to, something that we talked about in Chicago earlier this year is something we have been working on as a company for a long time. And it's not just us. Again, academic institutions have thought a lot about this as well. But in order for us to really understand climate change, natural hazard or peril risk, we have to have data which is scaled, connected. There has to be a confluence of data. And just so you all know, here at CoreLogic, what we have done since the creation of the company is we've now geospatially mapped every parcel of land in the United States with the boundary. We have a structure footprint for every structure on every parcel of land. We have the centroid for every location of every structure of every property. We track the building costs across the entire United States. So we can tell you the cost of sheetrock in Bangor, Maine versus Houston, Texas, and how that contributes to our cost estimations in terms of loss, et cetera, et cetera. So the conversation today is not just about science, though. It is about incentives and transparency. It is about money supply and investors. It is a point that Joel made earlier. It is about policy. It is about collateral and the stability of collateral relative to lending, relative to property casualty insurance. It is mortgage insurance in the FHA MMI fund. And it's even a little bit about municipal bonds. So it is a lot of things. The words we've been using are important: mitigation, sustainability, resilience. One that we haven't talked about, but one that's being talked about globally, one that's being talked that we will have hard conversations about here in the United States as well, is whether there will be staged, organized coastal retreats over time as sea levels rise. It is about hard questions about cross-subsidization versus an absolute pure rank ordering of risk relative to pricing. It is about collateral valuation and how peril risk is going to contribute to collateral valuation going forward. So I'm going to skim through a lot of this topic very, very quickly, but I just wanted to start with let me see if I can advance my slide. Well, there we go. So this whole conversation about climate change, of course, and about natural hazard risk is not something that is happening locally here in the United States first. In fact, it was the Bank of England and ultimately many, many other organizations, many other financial major central banks around the world who formed what is now called the Network for Greening the Financial System. This is an important, influential dialogue that's happening at the national level. I realize it doesn't matter today necessarily directly to how you sell a home in a local community, but it matters. And it matters because there's going to be some interesting extended effects of this dialogue that apply to the financial services industry and really housing finance and the housing finance ecosystem. So here in the US, a couple of years ago, if you talked about climate change and you cared about it, you must be a Democrat. But if you talked about taxpayer risk and the need to ensure we understood and buffered taxpayers from risk, it had to be a Republican. Over the last 18 months or so, I think a lot of that has begun to drop by the wayside. Today, we see consensus beginning to build around really peril risk, and that consensus really is despite some of the differing views about causation, which is really where the climate change dialogue occurs. And that's important, though. So this is where we now see Chairman Powell in monetary policy hearings being asked questions, bipartisan questions, about climate change, about natural hazard risk, and how that affects their portfolio. You see regulators getting these questions as well. FHFA Director Calabria and Secretary Carson were asked about quantifying natural hazard risk in hearings within the last 12 months. In the marketplace, and Joel touched on this in his presentation, but let me just go to a different example. BlackRock, early this year, Fink announced that they were going to include long-term natural hazard risk across all investments. So notably in the housing finance ecosystem, that includes all CRT investments that they make, and they're one of the biggest CRT owners in the world today. States have actually, for some time, California, by the way, so Eileen, your home state of California, has been out on the front end of peril risk disclosures. Texas, though, and this is one of those interesting contrasts, kind of more of a reddish state and a very blue state, you know, peril risk disclosures. New York looking at peril risk disclosures. And so this is very much right at the nexus of I think, the relationship between realtors and their clients and home ownership. And I think we'll see the peril risk disclosure issue advance materially over the next probably 24 months at the state level, regardless of what happens at the federal level. But there is this whole dialogue going on. And by the way, one reminder, Fink and Hugh Frater were together at BlackRock. And of course, Hugh Frater is now the CEO of Fannie Mae. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I get deeper into it. But at a very high level across investors, we're seeing this dialogue about peril risk, natural hazard risk, climate change, maturing and accelerating materially. So let's just look at local economies. I'm just going to throw up this slide. It is one example. We know that delinquency rates jump after natural disasters, and then there's a question of longitudinally, how quickly does a community recover? So we had our economists run a little bit of that data, and you can see we have some hurricane examples: Harvey, Florence, Michael. We have some wildfire examples, the Camp Fire and the Tubbs Fire out in California. So we know that it takes time for recovery to occur. COVID-19 is introducing, of course, a whole new kind of pandemic peril risk, if you will, that's going to raise a plethora of new questions. Well, what's interesting about the data here is maybe what's not here, and that is what happens with those who are in delinquency. And the Urban Institute shows that credit score recovery for low to moderate income consumers takes probably 7 years. During that period of time, some of that LMI community lose their home along the way. So in other words, it isn't just that the community recovers. One of the hard questions we're facing in this country is the fairness of the system and the mechanism by which consumers can stay in their homes, particularly if you're a low to moderate income consumer. You worked hard for that down payment, and this catastrophic event, this exogenous event, has had an effect on you. And how do I stay in my home? Or do I just lose all of that small amount of wealth that I aggregated up in the first place? We've had conversations with the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, and municipal securities are going to be scrutinized much, much more carefully relative to natural hazard or peril risk as well. Not surprising, by the way. It is your local markets, which are part of the tax base, of course, which contributes to the stability of that municipality, which contributes to the interest of investors in making progress or investing in those bonds and holding them to maturity. So again, peril risk is beginning to make its way into the pricing. So let's just look at money supply and regulators. And let me tell you a little bit about where we are. So over the course of this year thus far, we've had first and second dialogues with FHFA, obviously the regulator, the Federal Home Loan Banks directly, as well as Fannie and Freddie, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve. We've had direct dialogue with Fannie and Freddie themselves, with Ginnie Mae, and with a number of the largest federal home loan banks in the United States. Not a single one of these entities or organizations has put aside and said, you know, peril risk is something we're going to deal with for another day. Notably, in a conversation I had with one of the GSEs within the last 3 weeks, I said, I think probably I'm tenured. How can we talk about peril risk in the middle of COVID-19? And actually, the leadership team said, nope, it's just the opposite. We're going to have this conversation now, and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do going forward. To give you an example of how peril risk may work into pricing of properties, it is possible that in the loan level data sets, which accompany every loan that's securitized in a pool, there will be an estimate of the risk of that property relative to various perils to which that property is exposed. Senator Warren recently has called for an SEC requirement for climate change disclosures. We've actually seen language up on Capitol Hill on this very topic. Several different House bills were introduced early on, essentially messaging bills. But I think this whole issue is gaining ground. And this will mean that every issuer in the PLS market will have to say something about climate change and the risks of climate change relative to the issuances that they release into the private label securitization market as well. I think we're all on the same page. We care about this because it's all about money supply. It's all about investors, and it's all about investors wanting to price for that risk relative to the money that they're willing to invest in those securitized mortgage loans, which are obviously the loans that allow your customers and clients to make the whole purchase in the first place. There are a number of private sector, public sector dialogues going on. Here's just 3 of them. I just want to give you an idea, but there's a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. There's a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes. It's important to know that it's there. We have some dialogues as CoreLogic with some of these organizations as well. So let's actually take a look at the science. And let me just start with this. This to me is always the best first slide. This is our worldview. We have probably 200 PhDs who are seismologists and climatologists and who are experts in riverine flooding versus storm surge flooding, and then we have a number of actuaries that help us understand how these risks map into insurance marketplaces, both primary as well as reinsurance. We have civil engineers who are helping us understand reconstruction cost and building construction requirements going forward, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all the confluence of all of these different scientific endeavors and all of this research, including, by the way, our new Geospatial Center for Excellence in Boulder, Colorado, which is where we get all of our data, our satellite feeds from NOAA in terms of looking at various climate activity across the United States, which maps into our database, which allows us to build our models. But our models, not surprisingly, deal with coastal risks of various types, as well as wildfire. And you can see all the usual suspects here. I think when you talk about peril risk or natural hazard risk in Washington, people think mostly about hurricanes, or they think generally about flood, more notably, and to Vince's point earlier, a wildfire risk suddenly has cycled up a bit, not just here in the US, but actually with our teams in Australia as well. But we actually look for unusual risks, sinkhole risks in states like Florida. We look at fire protection classification, and all of these various databases contribute. Hail, by the way, Joel talked about a town in Kansas and its remarkable recovery. I grew up in Kansas, and I remember standing outside my house holding hail the size, for me at least, of a softball that had landed in our yard. So there is a lot going on out in the marketplace in terms of the various risks that are faced by properties today. All of these mapped together. We have models for each one of these individual risks, and then I'm going to show you how we actually create aggregated risks. So just an example of the tracking of the science, and this is why we're having this dialogue with federal housing agencies, with other federal financial services regulators, primary and secondary markets. And that is that we're learning, not just us as CoreLogic, although we are one of the primary data and analytics providers to the California Earthquake Authority. We're also one of the primary data and analytics providers to FEMA. I say that not to promote CoreLogic, but to let you know that our interactions are really a yin and yang. Our interactions with the scientists in California, with the scientists at the US Geological Survey, the scientists at NOAA, and the scientists at FEMA help us improve our private sector investments as well. But if you look at the left-hand versus the right-hand view of California, there was a remarkable learning moment that we have had relative to just one type of peril risk, in this case, it's earthquake. And you can see how a series of dots that generally connected along the San Andreas Fault suddenly jumped forward into 2019, and the new learning suggests not only do those dots are much more tightly connected together, but they extend much more so from the south to the north continuously. And so faults and activity in the south can and ultimately will have effects on activity, seismic activity much further north than we ever imagined. And this has to map into how California manages earthquake risk overall. By the way, as a company that has a tower in Irvine, California, this has to do with business continuity and safety and questions relative to those towers as well. It is a central question, of course, for major cities like Los Angeles or of course, like San Francisco as well. So this is just one of those granular analytic moments in the middle of the science that helps us understand what's changing. And candidly, it's a company like ours and our competitors. Iron sharpens iron. We're all in favor of that meritocracy. If we're going to win, we should win because we built the best mousetrap in terms of how this works. But let me show you what we have been doing. So we build composite risk maps. And in fact, our mapping look across, as you know, the whole United Nation, estimated damage, and ultimately get this down to a property level view of what's happening in your neighborhood. So any one of you as a realtor could reach out to us and say, house by house within the market that I dominate, what's the peril risk? And how much of that should I discuss with my client? I think that's one of the more interesting questions we have going forward as a society is that question of peril risk. So what we've done is we've now built a composite score for the entire United States. So this is obviously, so we have a risk score. All of us know about a FICO score for a credit report. Well, this is essentially your risk score for every property in the United States. So it isn't simply, and the interesting difference between what we do and some of the other science and analytics that historically has been done is that a Standard & Poor's or a Moody's or a Fitch, they have climate scientists, they do a great job, but they generally understand North Sea risks relative to oil rigs or Gulf Coast risks relative to oil rigs. They don't have any way of getting down property by property. And that's really what's being demanded progressively through the dialogue that we've seen and experienced with the Federal Reserve, for the money center banks, for the FDIC, for independent community banks, even the NCUA. We've started to have a conversation with credit unions. And in fact, I sat down with the International Finance Corporation, which is, of course, the for-profit arm of the World Bank, and I had a chat about climate change with Pierce Stein, who runs the climate finance investment house for IFC. And he said, I wish we had the ability to get down to structure by structure in most of the rest of the world. Similar conversation we're having now with Dick Berner, who's the first head of the Office of Financial Research within the financial, with FSOC. Dick is now at NYU Stern School of Business, and we're having a conversation with him and with a volatility institute that he's created. But once you have this composite risk, the real question is, how do you stack rank the risks that are most particular to a property? So this is where we can get down into, for example, earthquake risk across the US. Not surprising to see, those heat maps around the coastal regions and in California most notably, and then up through portions of Washington State. Not as well known, by the way, even with legislators, what's going on in places like Tennessee and cutting through Arkansas and even down through Mississippi. So this is kind of a look at earthquake. We also can tell you about hurricane wind risk. So this is different than hurricane. This is the wind risk relative to a hurricane. That sometimes drives the storm surge. That also drives roofline damage, which can give rise to rainfall damage to a property as well. Here's a big one, convective storm risk. So we can give you this, and we see this. Now, this goes back to Kansas and tornadic activity in central portions of the United States. And here's winter storm risk as well. So we can stack rank for any property in the US, not only the composite score, and not only at the property level, right? The composite score, but at the property level, but we can tell you what stack ranked those properties, even wildfire risk in the United States as well. Across all these different risks, we see more persistent, more frequent, and more severe events. So again, I think the dialogue we're having here, the question of resilience, the question of mitigation around all those properties built before 1970, if you will, the question of staged retreats and whether that's even possible, and even how we price and cross-subsidize risk more extensively or in a more limited way are all part of the housing finance ecosystem going forward. So for every property you're showing, there's a loan that most likely is going to become critically important. And with such a huge percentage of the marketplace still centered around particularly Fannie, Freddie, and FHA lending, and the offloading of that risk onto these federal agencies or these semi-federal agencies. This question of peril is going to accelerate and become more significant, and ultimately will have effects on how markets operate, the sufficiency of property casualty insurance, and so on and so forth. So I plowed through a lot of territory fairly quickly. Hopefully that was helpful to all of you. I think I'm going to just stop sharing there and see if there's any questions we want to get into.
Yes, we do have questions. And I have to say that hiring 200 PhDs to get this data, I'm really busting a green nerd gasket right now with all of this data. And I'm sure that we have a few English majors that are impressed by your vocabulary. Two words I wrote down were confluence and meritocracy. I mean, I have to look that one up. I have to Google that one. So I'm really impressed. But all of this data is incredible. So we do have questions. The first one is this data available to realtors and insurance companies?
So yeah, that's a great question, Eileen. And the answer is insurance companies. By the way, that's really where a lot of this was built. So the beauty of it is private sector, classic private sector R&D investment. We built all of this for the property casualty insurance marketplace, by extension, the reinsurance marketplace. And now what we're seeing is essentially a cut and paste of all of that platforming and technology and data and analytics moving into what we now call the housing finance ecosystem. So.
Mentioned that you were seeing more consistent, more frequent, more intense for all these different hazards. Can you quantify, is there a way to quantify how much more intense? I'm really putting you on task here about your data.
So I'll give you a couple of there's a couple of easy public examples of just intensity. There's a lot of criticism of the NFIP program. Everybody grits their teeth, and we all debate every time a FEMA map is issued, whether somebody's in or out, and do we have a LOMA letter or something that allows me to stay out when I otherwise should be in, and all of that. And if you listen to the smaller government voice, they would say, look at that program. It's underwater by billions of dollars. It was poorly managed, and it was never managed well. We never should have gotten into this business in the first place. However, it was really Superstorm Sandy and Katrina that drove a massive percentage of the indebtedness. But what we've seen now is, even with debt forgiveness, Eileen, new events are driving billions of dollars in losses beyond what is currently paid in terms of premium. So we are seeing that is one easy way for us to just eyeball that risk. And following up on this, all those PhDs and scientists, I'm just going to fling this question in their direction. If you don't mind, what I'll do is have us put together a quick report for all of you on just what we see. And maybe we could share that with you, and maybe you could share that with the NAR leadership team in this meeting today. Happy to do that. Absolutely, because what I really appreciate about these three presentations is that it is data, data, data. And that is powerful when it comes to us as real estate professionals. It's like having this in our toolbox and having the sources for it just brings us up to the next level. So Kim from Traverse, he says, I wonder how having access to this data by the consumer, will it drive future migration patterns? And it's kind of what Dr. Jessica touched on in her presentation a little bit about going to the more rural areas. So do you have any data that shows different migration patterns, or is that too soon? So first of all, well, all right, so let's go to a real world example of the difference between making data available and how consumers react to it. So really, I'm now in Jessica's world, not my world as much, but so in North Carolina, they made available through their essentially emergency management agency, they made available flood risks of various types, property by property. That did not increase flood insurance coverage by even more than 2 basis points. So that's one of the more interesting dynamics in all of this is how will it, and I would say, by the way, and this actually goes to some of the other research that was done previously, housing supply, the housing stock, demand versus stock availability is probably muting some of the interest that consumers might have in all of the greening of the housing ecosystem going forward. And also probably in context for that, the peril risks that are involved. In other words, I just don't have enough houses to choose from to be highly selective and pick the house that I think really gets to all of those green features, if you will, that I think are super important to me as a person, because housing prices have climbed astronomically, and because we're just struggling to win a bid, and we're still in a bidding war with others just to win the house. So I will say that as housing stock begins to align with demand, I think some of what we're talking about, Eileen, will actually come to the forefront even more. And by the way, we're going to experiment through our Matrix platform with making data like this available. And this is in partnership with the relationship that we have with realtors. And we'll have this dialogue with all of you first. How would it work? What do you think? How would it inform your buyer? You're on the front lines. You're the ones that talk to that buyer first and foremost. You're the ones who know that buyer best.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for us being on the first dibs on this information. We really appreciate it. And Craig Foley makes a comment here. He says, it's worth remarking how many market actors like CoreLogic have actively involved in analyzing climate risk. This kind of data could be so valuable in informing our members that we need to be involved in the conversation of climate risk. Maybe even us boomers might be able to understand this argument. And I think this is true. There was a great documentary about rising tide in Miami, where these oceanfront luxury condos were now at risk of flooding, and how they are moving into the high, just 10 feet higher is affecting gentrification in that area. And so I think that could this data be used against us? I mean, that is definitely food for thought when it comes to where certain developers develop, or where they invest their dollar.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, by the way. Let me give you some, I would agree that builders come to us as well saying, help us understand risks and climate risks. The good news would be, as we progress forward with new stock being built, is that less of that stock should be built in areas where it shouldn't be built. So I'm just talking about, but one of the harder questions is going to be, what do you do about stock that is aging out and needs to be replaced? And then this gets into housing affordability, by the way, Eileen, which is near and dear to us. We have a whole separate initiative on housing affordability. I can't get into all of it today, but it involves the climate, all the peril risk data, but it involves our other data. And by the way, we've joined with the NBA. We briefed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on this. We briefed the White House on this. We see a tremendous opportunity for federal dollars that flow through HUD and other agencies. And we've done a beta test with MBA in Memphis, Tennessee. We involved the mayor, we involved the state housing agencies. We have a relationship with Stockton William at the National Council of State Housing Agencies. And the key is to use this data to accelerate the right blend of building to get to the incentives and encourage builders to build, but to increase and preserve and increase affordable housing stock. One aspect of that, though, I had a conversation with Senator Menendez about this, is understanding what kind of building to be built and what kind of construction and how much retail you need at the bottom of the building, and that's going to absorb the flood from a surge-like risk, but you're still going to have all of the housing supply above it. Sustainable, as long as you figured out how to seal off all the utilities and they don't all get shut down. So we actually have mapped all the opportunity zones into this geospatial database as well, Eileen. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, data for good, analytics for good. Mm-hmm. We actually, in Memphis, we actually consulted with realtors in Memphis as well. So realtors are central to this affordable housing dialogue. And I will say that there's some interesting blend, I think, between the peril risk dialogue and sustainable housing and the development of, but also building housing which is affordable and meets the low to moderate income needs of consumers, and where you have the right market incentives in place so that money supply flows in that direction. So I think we're at the cusp of something really interesting here. We did a beta. We were going to do more betas until COVID-19 arrived. but we're going to get back into the business of these beta tests going forward. And I'm actually going to bother Joe Ventrone and Bill McCasian and others to talk a little bit more about this.
Well, it's unfortunate we only have about one more minute together because John Roschert from Texas, Austin, has a really good point about who is at the table in Washington. And you mentioned Senator Menendez, but also that this is not a blue issue, this is not a red issue. You know, this is really an infrastructure and a security, you know, a United States kind of a security issue, really, you know, having good infrastructure and making sure that we have safe housing. But I'm also curious about, that's what I want, a home security issue. So I am curious about the conversation regarding the office apocalypse, you know, that office space being essentially deserted and all of us working from home. Have you been seeing data coming in about industrial areas being repurposed or commercial areas being repurposed for affordable housing per se?
So actually, so the answer is, first of all, COVID-19, way too early, of course. We don't really know what all the extended collateral effects will be, whether some are more temporary and some are more permanent. We see, and by the way, the manufacturing of mortgages, if you will, you know, Ron will solve for some of the remote notary issues, and we'll become much more efficient in the cost of originating a mortgage as a result of COVID-19. Stepping through that, though, we actually did some work in an opportunity zone in New Jersey, and that's exactly what we did, Eileen. We identified residential properties that we thought were sustainable and fit within the demographic for affordability, and then we looked at and located light industrial, which wouldn't need usually the heavy remediation kinds of problems that you'd have. And you don't want to build on a Superfund site, for example. But this is where we actually were able to show state and local, particularly, I think the point was made earlier, mayors are way out in front on all of this. The answer is absolutely, mayors are way out in front on all of this. It's a lot easier to go to a city council and to the governing structure of a municipality and say, rezone for mixed use, commercial, residential, multifamily, single. And so we think that's really going to be the targeting tool of the future, Eileen. And that is a way, by the way, to increase housing supply much closer to work. Now, one of the more interesting questions is, much closer to work means what these days? Does it mean having a Zoom room in my house, or does it mean I'm physically commuting to an office, or am I commuting more frequently or less frequently? And look, I moved onto Capitol Hill out of suburbia here in Washington, D.C. because I love biking to work, and Washington's a decently friendly biking city. So
yeah. It's interesting what our needs will be and what the future of real estate will be. And once again, to be at the point of the spear to have this conversation is a true gift that we're giving to our members. So thank you so much, Stuart. We really appreciate your data. And I want to remind everyone, if you have more questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat so we can address them. And those of you that are watching us on YouTube, please feel free to post questions there too. So our next speaker is what I consider one of the best kept secrets in the industry. She is the Vice President of the of Urban Resilience from the Urban Lands Institute. And every time I see a report from the Urban Land Institute, it is very enlightening and just like, where have you been all my life? So Catherine leads the Urban Land Institute's Urban Resilience Program through research, advisory services, convenings, and outreach. ULI's Urban Resilience Program helps ULI members, the industry, and communities be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. At ULI, she has authored and co-authored recent reports on climate resilience, real estate, and land using climate change and real estate investment decision-making, harvesting the value of water and scorched, extreme heat, and real estate. An urban planner with 15 years of experience, she has practiced in the US, the UK, and Germany, with global project work across the US, Europe, and Asia. She began her career at Duany Platter Zyberg and Company, where she managed post-Katrina hurricane recovery charrettes commissioned by the state of Louisiana and Mississippi and the city of New Orleans. Since then, her projects have included a large-scale, mixed-use master planning initiatives designed to encourage pedestrian activity and integrate green infrastructure, including campus plans, downtown revitalization plans, urban extensions, and new town of 10,000 people in Scotland. Her research has included landscape performance research for Landscape Architect Foundation, as well as international urban policy research for Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program. And this belies all this experience, and she is so young. Let's please introduce Catherine Burgess. Please, I'm really fascinated what you have to bring to us today.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for that incredibly flattering introduction, and everyone for being here today. I'm really flattered and excited to hear that you think ULI and the Urban Resilience Program at ULI are some of the best kept secrets. So I hope coming here we can get the secret out there and share the work with all of you and the NAR membership and others. And yeah, no need for the big intro, but I've put together a slide deck which shares much of our current research and thinking about urban resilience at ULI. And knowing that we're at the end of an awesome summit with some incredible speakers today, I've tried to integrate a little more facilitated discussion so we can hear from each other where everyone is seeing trends in their own market and in their own work. So please bear with me as we try that out. I know we're all subject to some Zoom fatigue every now and then, so this should be a good break, but be prepared to use your mouse and click around in response to a few questions. So with today's presentation, I have things broken up into 3 sections. Please add questions at any point, but there'll be probably 3 key areas. First, a quick introduction to our resilience work at ULI and how ULI has framed this issue as a fellow membership organization focused on the built environment, real estate, and land use. Next, how these themes have changed and advanced in 2020, given everything that has happened. What an incredible year it has been. And prepping for this event and speaking with Amanda, we had joked about an event which NAR held in February in Chicago, which I was unable to attend. And here I am now just dreaming of a trip to Chicago and how great it would have been to have a coffee in the airport and everything else. So a lot has changed, and with that, our thinking on resilience and climate adaptation has changed. Then finally, I will do a quick overview into 2 ongoing research initiatives, and much of this aligns with what we've already heard today. So I may be quick in some areas because you've already heard about some topics from the fantastic experts today. So first, I assume that most of you are familiar with ULI, but to quickly reiterate in case anyone on the line is not, we are a global membership organization of about 45,000 people around the world in real estate, land use, and built environment. We're very much a big tent industry group with professionals from all different types of fields who relate to our mission around providing leadership in the responsible use of land and creating and sustaining thriving communities. Our resilience program, which I run, sits within our larger sustainability portfolio. Within the sustainability portfolio, we also have programs on climate mitigation and building performance, as well as health. I found it really fascinating to collaborate across these 3 areas because obviously there's many synergies in terms of the built environment. We're also all at different places in the process of trying to measure and produce metrics for outcomes, with energy having been well measured and many standards in place, such as LEED, health increasingly being measured through standards like Fitwel and Well, and resilience really just starting on that trajectory, first with a focus on data on vulnerabilities, which we've heard a bit about today, before that data on resilience. And we've had an urban resilience program since 2014. Some of the pictures show some of our members in action advising communities, as well as members in action looking at sunny day flooding in Annapolis, Maryland, where you see a historic core being very much threatened by the impacts of climate change. So what is our kind of core driving force? I would say it's a sense of urgency. And I include a photo from Realtor magazine because I see that with your audience, that is resonating too. Climate change, we don't have 50 years to wait. And we heard at the start of this event today from Vince Malta, very compelling words about the damages, the human toll, the costs due to the increasingly destructive storms that we're seeing and increasing frequency and intensity of climate events. I think flooding was an issue which has been on ULI members' minds for a long time. And this urban resilience program was established after Sandy, at the time when there was a big focus on recovering from and bouncing back after big events. Now the program's still looking at that, but we're also looking at what the long-term impacts of climate risk will be to all of our work and to the markets and to best practices overall. And how can built environment practitioners both better address climate risk and scale the resilience planning accordingly? So I won't need to go into this too much, because again, you already heard from Vince at the start of the Sustainability Summit, but we are really seeing increased concern among the ULI membership about physical vulnerability to extreme events. And personally, I saw that 2017 hurricane season as a wake-up call with Harvey, Maria, and Irma all happening in short succession. We were getting phone calls at ULI saying, what information do you have for your members? How can we be prepared for this? But there are many other reasons that the members are also gaining interest and concern about these topics. Everything from concerns about the long-term availability of insurance to policy changes to the types of benchmarking that they may be doing for their institutional investors. So let's take a quick facilitation break then to hear how this relates to what all of you are seeing. So I hope some folks have used the Annotate tool before. Take a look. You have a black bar somewhere on your Zoom screen. It is probably at the top. And take a look there, and you can see Annotate as an option. And then you can click View Options, and you'll see all of these different stickers and whatnot. So hope that makes sense. Next slide. So take a second and please stamp which climate risks you are thinking about, or or the folks in your market are thinking about. Everything from increasingly frequent and intense storms to sea level rise, extreme heat, drought, wildfires. Are these part of your discussions day to day?
So Catherine, I am hovering my cursor on the very top of my computer screen, and in green it says you are viewing Catherine Burgess's screen, and right next to it says View Options. So I clicked on that. Annotate.
Click on Annotate, and then you see all these little stamps and stuff. And you can also use text even if you want to write something. So,
got you. Thank you. You're giving us a lot of freedom here.
Oh yeah, well, there's always a risk with the freedom, right? But this is great to see. Basically you have concerns across the board on all types of physical climate risk. So
right.
There's no one concern. I think when I started at ULI about 5 years ago, the storms would have really been the main concern. Now we're increasingly seeing discussion around extreme heat, and it's actually the biggest health risk in comparison to many other climate risks. Rise, wildfires. So I think we're essentially seeing everything across the board. And thanks to Amanda, she is doing some screen grabs, so you have a record of this. So I'm going to clear this. There we go. Next slide. Okay, I'm always like working on this too here. So at ULI, how are we looking at resilience in comparison to these vulnerabilities? First, we're seeing an increased discussion around what resilient land use means. And I've heard this in the discussion today already. How can future development be incentivized to be located in parts of cities which are least susceptible to climate risk? What types of infrastructure can cities put in place? How can transportation be well connected to this infrastructure? How can economic resilience be built out looking at a diversified economy which is not vulnerable to climate impacts? And how can cities be planning for the protection of all communities, knowing that low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately impacted by climate risk, given both the reduced funds to bounce back from an interruption and a historic location of marginalized communities in many cities and many city neighborhoods and districts which are most vulnerable to flooding and other concerns. The tools that we're starting to see at the city level are everything from zoning. At right, you see the Norfolk zoning, Vision 2100 plan. For anyone interested in this topic, I recommend you take a look. They have essentially categorized the whole city for high risk and high development, current and prospects. And they're looking to further incentivize essentially inland high ground development in parts of the city which is less susceptible to sea level rise as well as subsidence. We're also seeing an increased focus on resilient building codes, interest in incentives, transfer of development rights, again, to incentivize development in areas which are less susceptible, and lots of new funding tools to address this, with the core underlying assumption being that federal funding and post-disaster funding is unlikely to be the only game in town for the long term. Cities need to, and the private sector need to be prepared to prepare for these events. So what are we seeing at the building scale? Obviously, it's very different depending on where a building is located and what the physical risks are. But we're seeing everything from sort of building code plus to elevation, green infrastructure, elevating mechanicals, elevating entryways, energy resilience, buildings that can island. The image at right is Spalding Hospital in Boston, which can island for, I believe it's 3 days. Incredibly impressive given the extent of mechanical needs in a hospital. And also all the associated planning for business continuity, emergency evacuation, et cetera. And we have a case study library if anyone is interested in taking a look at developingresilience.uli.org. And at ULI, a big focus is the business case, because I think we'll ultimately see market penetration and pickup when there is a strong business case to work in this way. So we're profiling these resilient development projects and looking at how ROI has been generated, everything from avoided losses to integrating resilience measures into placemaking and other strategies that can enhance the attractiveness of a property.
And Catherine, forgive me for interrupting you, but for the beginning greenies in the room, when you talk about islanding the hospital in Boston, can you elaborate just a little bit more about what islanding means?
Oh, absolutely. And sorry to use the jargon. We're all always at risk of jargon when we're in partner groups. Islanding means operating off grid. So having that off grid resilient energy strategy in the event of a disruptive event like a hurricane. So in all of this work, we are seeing really important partnership from realtors. And I wanted to share first that we see NAR increasingly doing resilience and sustainability programming like this. And every time we're doing research on physical risk and different local best practices, we're often seeing realtor programs really bubbling to the top. Realtor flood awareness and training programs in Pinellas County, Florida is one example. A colleague who is researching wildfire resilience, a report we'll put out this fall and would love to share with NAR, has seen some strong examples from Colorado of realtors partnering on hazard mitigation planning for homeowners and raising awareness of preventative measures for wildfire risk. Next slide. So I'd be interested to hear, just to kind of take the temperature, what people are seeing in their markets in terms of strategies for enhancing resilience. So I think everyone has gotten used to the annotate, go to the options, the annotate. Would love to hear, what are you seeing in the markets where you work? Is there a either commitment to or a dialogue about infrastructure, parks, zoning, building code changes? What is the key focus there? This is really helpful and really interesting to see this focus across the board. And I'd say this is also what we're seeing at ULI. I think the discussion about parks seems to have really captured members' imagination, especially because parks offer such an important amenity and are something we're all probably appreciating more than ever right now. But all of these topics, we're seeing a lot of movement and interest from. So I'm going to clear this and do the quick screen grab. Great. Thank you. Next slide. And then similarly, I'd be interested, and though this may be a little jargony for green newbies, if any resilient design features are gaining traction in the markets where you work. Something I've noted here is that resilient design is not always the same as sustainable design. As we hear about, all the concerns about increased heat, often the first approach is more AC. And we're seeing markets where AC wasn't the norm in new condo buildings increasingly offer AC. So, there's a lot of complex discussions to happen here about both how to be more prepared for the climate impacts and be more resilient and sustainable and responsible with resource usage. Wow, again, widespread here. So we'll turn it off. So I'll clear it. 8. Thank you. So with that, I wanted to quickly share a few reflections. I know today's theme was around sustainable communities. So looking more broadly, how has ULI's approach changed in the past 4 or 5 months with COVID, increased recognition of racial injustice, and all the societal changes we're seeing? So just to quickly provide some commentary on that, I think first we saw a huge increase in the concept of an interest in resilience overall, but looking really at resilience in terms of adaptive capacity, how cities could be ready for a major change. And some of the cities where we've worked with their chief resilience officers spoke about how maybe they had not specifically addressed pandemics in their resilience planning, but having looked at broad strategies to partner across departments and to work to be ready for shocks and stresses had helped them try to be ready for this. We're also seeing an increased interest in community and social resilience, seeing how individuals and community members are really leaning on their neighbors to make it through this time of isolation. Next, an interest and continued commitment to addressing climate change, because storms and all of the physical risks we face are not going away. And if anything, people are more vulnerable in an upcoming era where cities have fewer resources to invest in infrastructure and be prepared. I highly recommend an excellent article from Next City from the Kresge Foundation, which is one of our partners, which really looked big picture at how resilience could change now and looking beyond just bouncing back, but addressing long-term systemic problems. And I can add the link in the chat at the end of this. So looking specifically at COVID and climate events, I think we are seeing cities that are even more concerned about this summer climate season. Their city budget reductions. The communities which are most at risk to COVID are also often most at risk to climate events. Social and physical distancing is a real challenge when you're thinking about these emergency management methods, which rely on getting large groups of people into one place. And also you don't know even about household challenges, getting all the food and supplies that are needed if you're needing to hunker down somewhere. So in short, this is potentially a difficult season that we are in right now. And ULI has a national webinar, which is actually free for all, not just members, next week. And I can put a link to that in the chat as well. And so, we see increased urgency and concern about what these events may mean, as well as concern around how much needed infrastructure is going to be funded. And in the past 3 months, we've seen, cities and states announcing that they're having to redirect funding that was intended for climate infrastructure projects. The National Disaster Resilience Competition, a major federal funded project, has had a very strict no delay policy, which will be an issue for many of the infrastructure projects. And then as we look at the communities which are the most impacted by climate events and by COVID, there's just many clear correlations and a need for resilience planning to recognize and try to right these long-term societal wrongs. One major research project that I recommend everyone looking into is research that came out this year looking at how redlining aligns with the urban heat island effect and seeing as much as a 12-degree Fahrenheit difference in cities between neighborhoods that were formerly redlined and more affluent areas in terms of temperature and access to green space and all those cooling mechanisms. So again, talking to our city partners, we are seeing city planners and climate resilience look to climate resilience planning as a strategy to address longstanding inequities. This just was in the New York Times this week from Houston, where a new strategy for investing in flood infrastructure is moving to highest need neighborhoods instead of worst first. Worst first indicates most flooding as opposed to most difficulty bouncing back from a flood or disruption. So encourage everyone to look at resources on this. The Georgetown Climate Center actually just launched an equitable climate adaptation toolkit today during this event. So that will be, I think, a helpful policy toolkit. So with that, I think all of those big picture conversations have really been underlying the work that we've continued to do this year. And, as we always have, trying to advance knowledge and industry acknowledgement of these issues. So with that, love to walk you through a couple quick projects that we're working on, unless there are any immediate questions. Eileen, did you have any from the chat?
We do, actually. The first one is, could you please share, is that possible, the redlining study in relationship to the heat island effect?
Yeah, I can put it into the chat after I'm done with the presentation.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And also, when you talk about resiliency and sustainability, they are two different things. My favorite AE from Traverse, Michigan, Kim, he talks about how if you think of it as a boxer in a boxing ring, he or she is both sustainable and resilient. Resilient because you could take a punch and recover quickly, sustainable that you can go all 12 rounds. And that's how, that's probably how we need to look at the difference between sustainability and resiliency. It's just a reference that I go to all the time. So thank you, Kim, for that. And he also has a question. Let me scroll up, please. Yeah. Here we go.
As you're scrolling, I love the boxer analogy. That's a great one.
I know, Kim, he's the brains. He's the brains. He says, one thing that has been very apparent during COVID has been supply chain capabilities. Are you looking at logistical systems?
You know, within ULI, we haven't been looking that much at logistical systems just because it's not a huge component of our membership. But I completely agree, it's a major issue. A lot of the most interesting post-Sandy resilience planning happened around Hunts Point, which is the food distribution center for all of New York City. And I absolutely agree, this is a core issue. And actually today, our ULI China colleagues were emailing about this. So it's a major point of discussion for sure, but it's not something we've had the opportunity to research in-house.
And also what's happening, another two conversations have talked about water reusage. That's something where I'm from, Orange County, California, we're probably on the forefront when it comes to reusing reclaimed water for instance, public landscaping projects, and also replacing those water thirsty areas with drought tolerant natives. So how often is water reusage part of the city planning conversation?
I think it's a big part of the conversation, but I agree that the conversation is probably happening more organically in parts of the country which have long dealt with water shortages like the Southwest. So this is definitely a core component. And at ULI, we're both looking at what cities are addressing in the resilience planning, but also at what developers are doing as they are designing their own projects. And we've had a number of case studies where water reuse has been a big focus.
Right. And in fact, I think it's called the Purple Pipe Project. And so all around South Orange County, you could see purple pipe everywhere. And so that's reclaimed water. Yeah. So Todd Shipman says a lot of what Minneapolis is doing is centered around rezoning and elimination of single family zoning. So here we go. On one side of the coin is Jessica talking about a resurgence of people wanting single family close to biking trails, but then of course in more urban areas, eliminating the single family so you can rezone and possibly have more housing or more affordable housing. And I think it comes down to using this presentation that you're giving us as a starting point regarding what does your city need? So if you look at 10 years from now, 20 years from now, rezoning according to what's happening with your particular climate risks, and where you take it from here to satisfy a growing population.
It's a huge issue. And it's, this could be your own 3-hour summit right here, I think, around zoning and climate risk. And it's definitely something which we're hearing more and more interest in within ULI. I think a good example of, a place where incentives for higher density could have a big part to play in reducing risk is a project we did a few years ago in Miami-Dade County, where they actually had neighborhoods where homeowners had been applying for buyouts from FEMA due to repetitive losses, weren't actually qualifying for the buyouts, actually wanted to relocate. And these are single family homeowners in neighborhoods that are flooding pretty regularly, but not regularly enough to qualify for a buyout. And so the county was looking at the time, they were advancing the Bright Line, which is a new TOD, high-speed rail, and looking at what could they do to incentivize affordable replacement housing in these future high density hubs. And, a project like that is like a 10+ year project. So.
Right. So thank you. So, okay, we're curious about these case studies. Let's get to it.
All right, so I will actually go pretty quickly because we're having such a good discussion here, but I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this research to take a look at our website, americas.uli.org/resilience. All of these reports are freely available. So first, just to share one project, which is on everyone's mind right now, we have an ongoing research initiative on extreme heat called Scorched, and looking, both at the public health impacts and the long-term economic impacts, and how these are likely to impact the real estate sector. And, something that I thought was interesting, especially for the NAR audience here, is that the discussion is not always all like doom and gloom about the fear of the health impacts, is also about changes in consumer behavior. So, speaking to one developer in the UK where, climate change isn't looking quite as bad as it is in other places, the question there was for outdoor leisure centers, maybe people would actually want to be outside and shopping more. So, a lot of, stepping back and strategizing about what people's day-to-day needs and lifestyles will be in the future, and planning for that instead of planning for the exact scenario that we're in right now. And with this report, we are looking both at what the future risks are for extreme heat and also how both the private and public sector are responding. So everything from new development and placemaking strategies to design strategies at the building level. And, we're always looking at what the ROI can be in terms of advancing this type of resilient design strategy. So everything from looking at construction costs and fewer delays from extreme heat days during construction, to marketing for green buildings, to attracting more tenants due to sort of an amenity-rich lifestyle, which incorporates extreme heat mitigation. And finally, I'll wrap up with a major project, which I was very excited to hear quoted at the start of the summit today, our research last year on climate change in real estate investment decision-making. And I think during my time at ULI, sort of the first spike in member interest that I personally saw on this topic was after that 2017 hurricane season. And then the next big bump was after we put out this research looking at how real estate investors and institutional investors are increasingly considering climate risk. And this, I think, moved it from a topic which was relevant to cities that are regularly experiencing extreme weather events to one which is really relevant to everyone. So a key finding and takeaway from the report was that, almost all of the real estate investors that we spoke with were looking at both physical climate risk, so the impacts from destructive events, and transition risks. So looking, what could the market shifts be? Migration, for example, what new policies are going to be required that will add costs? What are the resource availability issues to contend with? And so, I think this was, sort of a very clear framework that we saw our members using to think about climate risk. We also heard a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And first, almost everyone we spoke with said that they don't see climate risk currently priced into the market because the first mover doesn't determine the price. But they're trying to, for those that are being more proactive around this, they're becoming more aware that it could have an impact over the longer term. Next, there is a real concern around this question around the parallel issues of risk and resilience, how difficult it is to actually measure the impact that resilience measures have on the vulnerability of real estate development or portfolio. So the image at right is a study that the climate analytics firm 427 put out, which looked at various real estate investment trust portfolios and which ones had the highest vulnerability to climate events. And most of the red dots, so the red is like the bad place to be, are REITs with a lot of holdings in Asia. And so this, this is a very telling graphic, but at the same time, none of these data points indicate what types of infrastructural investments cities are making. They don't indicate what types of preparation is happening at the building level, whether buildings are elevated, have the mechanicals out of harm's way, et cetera. So there is a real fear around data being taken out of context, and also recognition of the need for more nuanced data. So what were some of the emerging practices that we saw within this research? So first, almost every real estate investment manager we spoke with is mapping the physical risk of their current portfolios and potential acquisitions. And many are using third-party consultants to do this, but there's also a lot of data that's more and more readily available online. Right, I put, because I'm in DC, a map from the First Street Foundation's new tool, which came out last month, which I'm sure was at the point of discussion for this group around flood risk and property. So we're seeing more and more of real estate investment managers mapping physical risk. We're seeing them be increasingly proactive around incorporating resilient design measures and mitigation approaches into into future acquisitions, and to pricing that in, assuming those costs are going to be a necessary part of doing the deal. And then we are also seeing a variety of approaches to portfolio diversification, both amongst markets and also even properties within a market, looking at both waterfront properties and inland high ground properties within a single market. And then finally, we saw more of proactive interest in engaging with policymakers on these issues. Real estate investment managers saying we're actually like trying to read our city's resilience plan, which is not something that I had heard of a few years ago. So here's, I think it's like the elephant in the room question. I would love to see what everyone thinks of this question around whether you are seeing climate risk priced into the markets where you worked. And I'm happy to share how I think your answer compares with what we're seeing from ULI. So again, back to annotate, do you think climate risk is priced into the market where you're working? Is it sometimes priced into the market? Maybe there may be an amenity boost from a resilient design project, or you may have concerns about flood vulnerability, or do you think it's really not priced in?
While they are answering, could I please put the website you mentioned a little bit earlier into the chat here?
Oh, sure. Yeah, our website for the resilience program at ULI is americas.uli.org/urban resilience. So I think I see these reactions, and I'll probably turn this off in a second. We have one person who sees climate risk priced into the market. Maybe you can put in the chat explanation or where you are, since it's so wildly different from the rest of the audience. And then we have a range from sometimes to no. And I would say that within the ULI membership, in the interviews we've done, we're probably a little closer to sometimes, but it's generally in the spectrum between sometimes and no. And we were also speaking to real estate investment managers who would explain that while they are pricing climate risk into the market, that may lead them to not pursue a deal, but then another willing buyer will come through, and therefore the price wasn't impacted. So I will turn this off, clear. And
Cindy Hayden, excuse me, from Florida. She says, I see the impact of elevated homes and reduced risk reflected in what buyers will pay most often in our area.
So that's really to hear. And I think within ULI, our members in Florida have been the most active on this topic, because both the extent of vulnerability, but also the extent of resilience planning that is happening in the market. So finally, let's hear, where do you think the market's going to be in 10 years? And I think, the ongoing question then is, what can organizations like NAR and ULI do, with this potential market shift? So we don't have any no, and we have a lot more yeses at this point. Well, I think maybe, this is, I'm going to put this back up and clear in a second. Thanks, Amanda, again for capturing this. I think this is really a call to action for all of our membership associations here, that, there is going to be a market shift, and what can we do to support the real estate, land use, and built environment industries as we, move into these future times where there is a greater recognition of the extent of risk that's faced, but there's also a lot of innovation that's happening in terms of resilient design, in terms of sustainability, and in terms of policies. And so actually, I think we're almost at time. So I may zip through the last slides. Final little pitch is later this summer/fall, we'll be putting out a follow-up report to that climate risk in real estate decision-making project, which is looking more at climate risk from the market side and looking at how investors are increasingly trying to understand how city resilience investment could or could not align with the extent of risk faced. So with that, I will wrap things up today because we've had a great discussion, and thank you very much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. And I hope everyone can see why ULI is one of the best kept secrets. I mean, this is an incredible amount of information and a great support system for NAR. And before I turn it over to Vince, I just want to hope everyone sees what NAR is doing for our members and that the conversation is changing. And now we have the tools and the data to go to our clients, but more importantly, go to those who make our public policy and to plan for good public policy, because nothing is more expensive than bad public policy. And that this is not a drill. This is not a partisan issue. This is a bipartisan issue. And one of the scariest things that I think took away from our meeting in February, was that we're no longer planning. We can no longer use the data of history to plan for the future. That we now need to project what our future is, especially with climate risk. And so now we have it. Now we have the data. Now we have the information. And where do we go from here? And finally, I just want to say I think it's cool to be a green nerd. I've been waiting for this day. I've been waiting for this day. So before I turn it over to Vince, once again, thank you to Amanda Stinton, Hugh Morris, Russell Riggs, and of course my Vice Chair, Georgia Meacham, for all their hard work and bringing this exceptional Sustainability Summit. Be the change you want to see in the world, and finally, be a beacon of light, because there's a great deal of darkness that's going through our times. And thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to continued conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Vince, our president, Vince Malta.
Thank you, everybody who joined us today. Thank you to our host and chair, Eileen Oldroyd, Vice Chair Georgia Meacham, NAR staff, our staff coordinator, Amanda Stinton, and thanks to all our speakers who took the time out of their busy schedule to educate us on this issue. We learned a lot, and the case has more than been made that it's time for action on sustainability. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us just how interconnected we are. Major life-altering events don't recognize borders, and a mission this big can't be accomplished through individual action alone. As Joel McCower asked, what would it take? Well, it takes national, state, and local leadership. That's why it's important for realtors to lead, not follow on this issue. The momentum is there. Realtors are ready to embrace change. As we've demonstrated with COVID, we eat change for breakfast. Very importantly, we must give realtors the tools to effectuate change. With America's 1.4 million realtors leading the way, we should all be excited for what the future holds. Thank you all, and all be well.
See you guys later.
Thank you all. Great job.